They said it was dead. 7 engineers, $2 million in diagnostic equipment, and 37 years of combined experience. And every single one of them agreed. The car was gone. But one man, a shop mechanic with grease under his fingernails and a dead father's notebook in his back pocket, walked into that boardroom and said 3 words that made an entire room of professionals laugh out loud. "I can fix it." What happened next didn't just save a legendary machine. It changed every life in that building, including his own. If you've ever been the person nobody believed in, stay with me. Like this video, drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story travels, and don't go anywhere. The fire started at 11:47 on a Tuesday night. Nobody saw it coming, which was the part that haunted Vanessa Mercer most afterward. Not the loss itself, but the fact that something so catastrophic had arrived without a single warning. One moment, the Sterling Performance Group warehouse on the eastern edge of Denton, Texas, was dark and locked and perfectly ordinary, and the next it was a column of orange light visible from the highway, drawing rubberneckers off the interstate before the first fire truck had even turned out of the station. By the time the crews got the blaze under control, 3 hours had passed and a significant portion of the east wing had collapsed. The damage to machinery and inventory was substantial enough that Sterling's insurance department would spend the better part of the following week compiling a loss assessment that ran 47 pages. But none of that, not the machinery, not the inventory, not the structural damage to the building itself, was what put the hollow expression on Calvin Rhodes's face when he arrived at 6 in the morning and stood at the edge of the cordoned-off area and stared at what remained. What remained was a car. Or rather, what had been a car. It sat in the center of the East Bay, partially visible through the tangle of collapsed shelving and fire suppression foam and the general wreckage of a space that had, until last night, housed some of the most sophisticated automotive restoration equipment in the southern United States. The car was a 1970 Dodge Challenger RT. Calvin's, personally, brought here 6 weeks ago to begin a meticulous frame-up restoration that he had been planning for the better part of a decade. It was painted in the original Hemi orange, or had been, once. Now the paint was scorched to something between rust and black across the passenger side and hood. The windshield had shattered from the heat. 2 tires had melted. One door was warped so badly it had separated from the body at the top hinge and hung at a strange angle like a broken wing. Calvin stood there for a long time without saying anything. He was 61 years old, built like a man who had done physical work somewhere in his past, and never quite lost the frame of it, even after 20 years of boardrooms and investment portfolios. He had the kind of face that had learned how to stay neutral in difficult situations, which had served him well through 3 decades of building and dismantling companies. But standing there at 6 in the morning with the smell of char still thick in the air and the sunrise turning the sky pink behind the wreckage, whatever that controlled expression usually contained was somewhere else. Vanessa gave him space. She was good at that, knowing when to let the air in a room breathe. She stood about 10 feet back, arms crossed against the morning chill, watching him process it without filling the silence with words. Eventually he said, "How bad is it? The actual assessment." "We don't have one yet," she said. "I've got Marcus and his team coming in at 8. "What's your gut telling you?" She looked at the car again, at the warped door, the melted rubber, the scorched hood. "I'll wait for Marcus," she said carefully. That was answer enough. Marcus Webb had been the chief engineer at Sterling Performance for 9 years, and he was the kind of man who treated uncertainty the way other people treated bad weather, as an inconvenience to be processed and dispatched as quickly as possible. He arrived at 7:45, walked the damage with his team for 2 hours, and by 10 o'clock had produced a preliminary assessment that ran 11 pages and contained exactly the kind of language insurance adjusters love. Extensive thermal damage to primary and secondary structural components, compromised frame integrity at multiple load-bearing junctions, irreparable damage to drivetrain components, total loss recommended pending final inspection. He presented this to Vanessa in the main conference room on the second floor at 11, with 3 of his engineers present and a set of photographs arranged on the table that documented the damage in the kind of detail that left nothing to imagination. "The frame is the issue," Marcus said. He was pointing to a photograph showing the undercarriage. "This section here, The torque boxes. Front subframe mounting. The heat warped them. You can see the deformation. A frame like this, on a car this age, you can't just bend it back. The metal's compromised at the molecular level. The car might look restorable from the outside if you spent enough money on cosmetics, but structurally, it would never be right. You'd spend a fortune and end up with something that handles like a boat and has the structural integrity of a tin can. What about sourcing a replacement frame, Vanessa asked, for a numbers-matching 70 Challenger R/T with the 446 pack? He shook his head. You'd be building a tribute car, not a restoration. The documentation would be worthless. The provenance Calvin values would be gone. And the engine? The 440 is a question mark. The block may be salvageable in isolation, but the ancillaries, the carburetors, the intake, the valve train, most of it is compromised. The electrical harness is gone. The interior is a complete loss. He paused. Look, Vanessa, I've been doing this a long time. Sometimes cars come back from bad accidents. This isn't an accident situation. This is sustained high heat exposure across a 40-minute window. The car absorbed that heat. It changed things we can't see yet. Even if we spent the money and the time, we'd be chasing problems for years. Vanessa tapped her pen on the notepad in front of her twice. What's your recommendation? Write it off. Take the insurance money. If Calvin wants a 70 Challenger, there are clean examples available. It won't be this specific car, but this specific car is the only one that matters to him, Vanessa said. She said it quietly, without editorializing. Marcus nodded. He understood that. It didn't change his assessment, but Calvin had requested a meeting at 2 o'clock that afternoon. By the time people started filing into the main conference room, word had spread through the building the way word always spreads through workplaces when something significant happens, imperfectly and quickly, trailing anxiety and speculation in equal measure. Most of the engineering staff knew that the meeting was about the Challenger. Most of them had seen Marcus's preliminary report or heard it summarized by someone who had. The general consensus in the break room and the hallways and the workshop floor was that the car was done. The conference room held 18 people around the main table and another 6 or 8 standing along the walls. Calvin sat at the head of the table, and whatever rawness had been visible in his face that morning had been replaced by something more composed. Not cold exactly, but compressed. Like he'd taken the morning and used it to put himself back together in a way that would hold for at least the duration of this meeting. Marcus sat to Vanessa's left and walked the room through his team's findings. He did it professionally, without embellishment. The photographs went around. The engineers at the table, 4 of them, all senior, asked questions and offered observations that were largely in agreement with the assessment. Nobody contradicted him. Nobody suggested a different conclusion. When Marcus finished, Vanessa looked to Calvin. "What are your thoughts?" Calvin looked at the photograph in front of him. The scorched hood, the melted tire, the warped door hanging at that wrong angle. He was quiet for a moment. "I bought that car when I was 24 years old," he said. "Paid $800 for it. It didn't run. I didn't know how to fix it. Took me 3 years of weekends before I had it running right." He paused. "My father, he didn't have a lot to teach me. Wasn't that kind of man. But that car, those 3 years, we spent time on it. That was our time." He stopped. Nobody said anything. "I'm not asking for sentiment to override good engineering judgment. I understand what Marcus is saying. Before we close the door on this, I want to make sure we've exhausted every avenue." "We have," Marcus said. Not unkindly. "I wouldn't tell you this if I wasn't certain." And that was probably where the meeting would have ended. The room had a kind of finality to it. The quiet, collective exhalation of a decision that everyone had already arrived at independently, just waiting for the words to make it official. That was when the door at the back of the room opened. Nobody noticed at first. Late arrivals to meetings at Sterling were not uncommon, and whoever it was slipped in quietly and stood near the back wall without interrupting. It was only when Marcus had finished talking and the brief heavy silence had settled that someone near the back shifted and drew enough attention for people to look. It was Ethan Brooks. He was 34 years old and had been a shop mechanic at Sterling for 2 years, assigned primarily to the preparation bays on the ground floor, where work was done on customer vehicles before they went to the engineering teams. He was not senior staff. He was not technically the sort of person who attended meetings like this one. He was wearing work pants and a Sterling Performance polo with a small grease stain near the collar that he had either not noticed or not had time to address. He had the kind of hands that told the story of the work before you got to the face, knuckles a little rough, nails cut short, a faint chemical smell underneath whatever soap he'd used. He wasn't particularly tall. He had brown hair that needed a cut and a face that was mostly unremarkable except for the eyes, which were paying attention to everything in the room at once in a way that might have read as nervous, but was actually something else entirely. Several people were looking at him now with the mild irritation of people whose meeting had just been interrupted by someone who had no obvious business being there. Vanessa said carefully, "Ethan." "I heard about the meeting," he said. "I know I shouldn't be here." He stopped, started again. "I've been in the East Bay since this morning. I've been looking at the car." Marcus turned in his chair slightly, looking at it. "Yes, sir? We spent 2 hours this morning with the assessment team." "I know. I read the report." He said it without any challenge in it, which somehow made it land stranger than if he'd been confrontational. I think there are some things it missed." The silence in the room changed quality. Marcus said, "You read my report." "Mr. Webb, with respect, the frame assessment is based on the visual deformation at the torque box sections. That's sound as far as it goes. But the fire started in the northeast corner of the bay, and the car was nose in. The damage on the passenger side is worse because of that, but the driver's side forward frame rails. I was underneath this morning, and I think the heat damage there is not what it looks like. The metal's discolored, but the deformation is superficial. I think the core integrity is better than the report suggests." "You think," Marcus said. "I would need more time to be certain, but yes." "Based on visual inspection, with no instruments." Ethan paused. "Based on experience," he said. "Instruments would confirm it." The energy in the room was the particular discomfort of a situation where someone has said something that can't be easily dismissed, but also can't be immediately verified. Marcus looked like a man containing several different responses and deciding which one to let out. Vanessa said evenly, "What are you proposing, Ethan?" He hesitated. She could see him working through something, the gap between what he knew and what he was about to commit to, which was not nothing. He was not, she noted, the kind of person who made statements like this carelessly. 30 days, he said. "Give me 30 days and access to the East Bay. I'll restore the car." There was a beat of absolute silence. And then, not cruelly but unavoidably, someone laughed. It wasn't one person, it was the particular spontaneous laughter of a room where something absurd has been said with a straight face, and it spread quickly through the table before several people caught themselves. Marcus didn't laugh, but his expression was a controlled version of the same response. Vanessa kept her face neutral with some effort. Even Calvin, at the head of the table, had something shifting in his expression that might, under different circumstances, have become a smile. "Son," Marcus said in the tone of a man who is trying to be patient, "we just walked you through an 11-page assessment conducted by 4 senior engineers with combined experience of—" "I've read it," Ethan said. "I understand why you arrived at your conclusions. I think some of them are wrong." "And what makes you qualified?" "I've been restoring cars since I was 17, Ethan said. "Mostly muscle cars, mostly this era. I worked at a specialty restoration shop in Lubbock for 6 years before I came here. I've rebuilt engines in worse condition than this one appears to be." He stopped. "I know what I look like in this room. I know what position I'm in, but I've been looking at that car all morning, and I believe it can come back. I'm asking for the chance to try." The room looked at Calvin. That was where this was going to land, and everyone knew it. Calvin was looking at Ethan, not with the polite tolerance of a man waiting for this to be over, actually looking at him. There was a quality of assessment in it that Ethan held steady under without flinching, which Calvin registered. 30 days, Calvin said. 30 days, Ethan confirmed. Calvin looked at Vanessa. Vanessa looked at Marcus. Marcus's jaw did a subtle thing. "With what resources?" Vanessa asked. "The East Bay, basic tooling. I'll work with what's there. If I need specific parts, I'll put in requests through the normal process. Working alone? If that's what I can have? Another silence, the kind that makes decisions without anyone declaring them. Calvin said, "Let him try." The first thing Ethan did after the meeting was go back to the East Bay and stand in the middle of it for a while. Not doing anything, just standing there with the car in front of him and the smell of char still faintly in the air and the afternoon light coming through the high windows in long yellow columns. He'd said what he'd said in that meeting because he believed it. He needed to keep saying it to himself now in the quiet of the empty bay, because there was a part of his brain, the part that had heard the laughter, had seen Marcus Webb's expression, had cataloged exactly how many people in that room considered him a presumptuous nobody, that was already performing detailed mathematics on everything that could go wrong. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out a notebook. It was the kind of battered composition notebook that you could find at any drugstore for $2, except that this one was at least 15 years old and had been repaired with electrical tape at the spine and had water damage at the bottom corner that had rippled the pages so they didn't sit flat anymore. He'd had it so long that he didn't really think about it much anymore. It was just part of what he carried, the way some people carry a wallet or a phone. His father's handwriting was on most of the early pages. Small, cramped lettering that listed carburetor settings and torque specifications and clearance measurements for engines that his father had worked on or rebuilt. Going back to when Ethan was maybe 9 or 10 years old and first started following the man into the garage on Saturday mornings. Later pages were in Ethan's own hand, same cramped style. A thing you pick up without noticing when you've spent years reading someone's writing. Notes from restoration jobs, measurements, things that worked, things that didn't, the sort of accumulation of practical knowledge that doesn't live in manuals because it comes from handling the actual physical objects. He walked to the car and crouched beside the driver's side front wheel well and ran his hand along the forward frame rail. The metal was discolored. Heat does that. Drives the color out of steel and replaces it with a gradient running from gray to a kind of mottled brown. Most people see that discoloration and assume the worst because it reads as damage, and the assumption is that visible damage equals structural failure. It's not a wrong assumption, necessarily. It's just not always right. What you have to feel for, and this is the part you cannot explain to a room full of people using a PowerPoint presentation, which is why Ethan had not attempted to explain it, is whether the metal has lost its memory. Steel, when it's healthy, has a particular quality of resistance under your hand. When heat has genuinely compromised it, that quality changes. The metal feels different. Ethan could not have written down in precise scientific terms exactly what the difference was. He had just handled enough metal in enough conditions to know it when he felt it. He moved his hand along the rail slowly. Here, good. Here, still there, here. He paused. This was the section that had made him walk into that meeting and say the thing that made people laugh. The discoloration was bad here. Under a photographic assessment, it would read as serious thermal damage, but the resistance under his hand was still present. The metal hadn't gone soft in the way truly compromised steel goes soft. It was possible, not certain, possible, that this frame had more structural integrity remaining than Marcus Webb's report credited it with. He sat back on his heels and looked at the car as a whole. The condition was bad. He wasn't pretending otherwise. The passenger side damage was severe and would require serious work. The windshield was gone. The interior was ash and melted plastic. The tires were gone. The electrical system was a complete loss. The engine, the 440 cubic inch six-pack that was the heart of this particular car, was going to be the real question, and he couldn't answer that question until he had it on a stand and a part. He had 30 days. He opened the notebook to a fresh page and started writing. He called home at 6:30 to let his mother-in-law know he'd be late. Sandra answered on the second ring, which meant she'd been expecting the call, which meant Lily had already mentioned that Daddy hadn't come home at the normal time. "How late?" Sandra asked. "I don't know. A while." He was already pulling things together in his head. The initial teardown sequence, what he needed to pull first, what equipment was available versus what he'd need to request. "Is she still up?" "Barely. She wants to talk to you." A rustling, and then a small voice. "Daddy? Hey, Bug, you doing okay?" Grandma made mac and cheese, but she made the wrong kind. Which kind did she make? The orange powder kind. I like the other kind. Kind with the shells? Yeah, that's the right kind, he agreed. That's what I said. He smiled without meaning to. Lily was 7 and had opinions about things the way certain people carry opinions about things. Not loudly, but with a kind of absolute and unshakable certainty that you couldn't really argue with. I'm going to be home late tonight, Bug. I've got a big project starting. How big? He looked at the Challenger in front of him. Very big, he said. Bigger than when you fixed Mr. Patton's truck? Yeah, a lot bigger than that. A pause. Then, can you fix it, though? The question landed with more weight than Lily intended. Or maybe exactly the right amount of weight, because Lily had a habit of asking the exact right question without knowing she was doing it. I think so, Ethan said. I think you can fix anything, she said, with the easy certainty of a 7-year-old who has not yet learned to be strategic about confidence. Get some sleep, okay? I'll see you in the morning. Okay. And then, as an afterthought, Daddy, what's the car's name? It doesn't have one. You should give it one, she said. It might help. He stood there holding his phone for a moment after she'd handed it back to Sandra. He worked until 2 in the morning that first night. The initial phase of any serious restoration is disassembly, which sounds straightforward but isn't. You have to take things apart in the right sequence, which means you have to understand the sequence first, which means you have to spend time looking before you start removing. Ethan was methodical about it in a way that would have looked to a casual observer like he was going slowly. He wasn't. He was building a map. He pulled the interior first, what was left of it, which was not much. The bucket seats had been burned badly enough that the foam had gone and the springs were exposed. The headliner was ash. The carpet had melted into the floor pan in some places and could be separated in others. He cataloged everything, not just what was lost, but what condition the underlying metal was in, which was the relevant question. The floor pans were concerning. There was fire damage in the passenger footwell that had transferred heat to the pan itself, and he spent 40 minutes with a light and a mirror checking the underside before he arrived at an assessment. Bad, but not catastrophic. Repairable. It would require fabricated sections, which would require sourcing the right gauge steel, which was a problem for tomorrow. He pulled the door panels. The driver's door was fine except for cosmetic heat damage at the top edge. The passenger door, the warped one, the one hanging wrong, was going to be the subject of extended consideration. The warp itself wasn't necessarily fatal. Doors can be worked. What mattered was whether the damage had extended into the door skin in a way that compromised the structural cavity. He removed the door from its hinges carefully, laid it on a pair of sawhorses, and spent time with it. He did not arrive at a final conclusion that night. He pulled the glass. The side windows had survived better than the windshield, which was a small mercy. He pulled the trim. He began on the engine bay. The 440 sat in there like something that had been through a war, which it had. The surface of the intake manifold and the valve covers was coated with a residue from the fire suppressant foam, and under that a layer of heat discoloration, and under that, this was the question, the engine itself. He didn't pull it that night. You don't yank an engine out of a car like that without a proper setup. He spent an hour instead removing the air cleaners from the 3 two-barrel carburetors that made this a 6-pack car, the intake configuration that defined what this engine was, mechanically and historically, and examining them in the light. The carburetors were bad, all 3. The accelerator pumps were compromised by the heat, the float bowls had warped on 2 of them, and the throttle shafts on the center carb showed damage that would probably mean replacement rather than rebuild. That was expensive. Correct 6-pack carburetors for a car like this were not easy to find and not cheap when you found them. He wrote it down in the notebook. He also wrote this: carbs worse than expected. Center carb probably NOS or quality rebuild. Check Strickland. Check Manny's inventory. Below that he wrote block, unknown, needed on the stand. Prioritize engine pull day 2. Below that, after a pause, he wrote frame. Driver's side better than assessment. Passenger side needs hands-on eval. Do not conclude until you can measure. He put the notebook back in his pocket. He looked at the car for a moment in the quiet of the empty bay, in the bad fluorescent light. I don't have a name for you yet, he said. The car did not respond, obviously, because it was a car. He turned off the lights and went home. The second and third days were engine extraction. He had a forklift at his disposal and a basic engine hoist, and he used both, carefully. The 440 came out on the afternoon of the second day and went onto an engine stand in the far corner of the bay where the light was best. Once it was up on the stand and Ethan could walk around it and get into it properly, the assessment began in earnest. What he found was complicated. The block itself, the main casting, the fundamental structure of the engine, was in better condition than he'd dared hope. Cast iron doesn't fail the way softer metals do under heat exposure, and the block had survived the fire without the kind of cracking or warping that would have made it scrap. He found one small crack in the water jacket on the passenger side that was going to need to be addressed. It could be repaired with the right process, which was not simple, but it could be done. The main bearing caps were straight. The journals, when he measured them, were within tolerances he could work with. The heads were a different problem. The aluminum intake manifold had taken serious heat and was almost certainly warped. The exhaust manifolds, cast iron, like the block, showed the same pattern as the block. Discoloration, some superficial damage, but potentially salvageable. The heads themselves he pulled on the third day, and that was where he found what he would later describe to no one in particular as the thing that would either save the project or kill it. The cylinder head on the number 4 and number 5 cylinders on the driver's side showed evidence of heat-induced distortion. The head surface, the part that mates with the block to seal the combustion chamber, was not flat. He measured it. 11 thousandths of an inch of warp. On a stock street rebuild, you might live with that. On a correct numbers-matching restoration of a car whose owner valued its authenticity above almost anything else, the answer was the heads needed to be resurfaced or replaced. Resurfacing was possible. He knew a machine shop in Fort Worth, a man named Gerald Pruitt, who was 70 years old and had been doing precision machine work since before Ethan was born. Gerald could take those heads and resurface them back to flat within a half-thousandth. The issue was that resurfacing changed the compression ratio slightly, which meant the head gaskets would need to be selected accordingly, which was a chain of decisions that all needed to be made correctly. He called Gerald that night. "How bad's the warp?" Gerald asked. 11 on 4 and 5. Others look straight. Gerald made a sound, not alarm exactly, more the sound of a craftsman computing variables. Resurfaceable. You lose a few thousandths of compression, but nothing you can't tune around. That's what I figured. What are you doing, Ethan? Restoration or driver? Restoration. Numbers matching. It needs to be correct. Then I'll be conservative. A pause. You know head gaskets for these things aren't off the shelf anymore. I know. I've got a call in to a supplier in Tennessee. Good. Send me the heads when you're ready. Go on. Marcus Webb came down to the East Bay on the 4th morning. Ethan heard him before he saw him, the sound of dress shoes on the concrete floor, which stood out against the backdrop of shop sounds. He was under the car at the time, which he did a lot of, examining the frame more carefully now that the drivetrain and most of the interior were out, and he had unobstructed access. He slid out from under the car and sat up on the creeper. Marcus looked at the state of the bay, the disassembled engine on the stand, the cataloged parts arranged on shelving units along the wall, the notebook open on the workbench. He looked at it the way an architect might look at a building site, assessing. "How's it going?" he said. "Okay," Ethan said. "What did you find on the frame?" Ethan stood up. He moved to the driver's side and pointed. "Pull up beside me." Marcus hesitated. He was wearing clothes that were not designed for crawling around car frames, but he crouched down beside Ethan. Ethan pointed to the forward rail sections and explained what he'd been looking at. He explained the measurement he'd taken and what it suggested about the residual structural integrity. Marcus listened. His expression was hard to read. "You might be right," Marcus said finally, which cost him something. You could tell. "I'd want to see the measurement data." "It's in here." Ethan held up the notebook. Marcus looked at the notebook, the battered, taped, water-damaged composition notebook. Something moved across his face that might have been the professional discomfort of a man who uses $400 digital measuring equipment and is being shown readings transcribed in pencil in a worn notebook, set against the more complicated discomfort of a man who knows those readings might be right. Put the measurements in the system, Marcus said. The project management system. I want a record. I'll do that. Marcus stood. He looked at the engine on the stand. What about the 440? Block's salvageable. Heads are at the machine shop. I've got carburetors sourced, waiting on confirmation. The intake manifold. Getting a correct original piece. It'll take time. Marcus nodded slowly. He was doing something with his face that wasn't quite admiration and wasn't quite its opposite. You know the department is watching this, he said. I know. Not rooting for you to fail, Marcus said. Just watching. I understand, Ethan said. Marcus looked at the car again. At the state of it. Partly dismantled, engine gone, interior stripped, looking less like a car now than like the skeleton of one. Then he looked at Ethan. You find anything that changes your assessment, Marcus said. You tell me. Yes, sir. Marcus left. Ethan watched him go, then turned back to the car. Vanessa came on day 6, in the evening, after most of the building had cleared out. She didn't announce herself. She came in through the side door and stood near the entrance, watching Ethan work for several minutes before he was aware she was there. He was at the engine stand, measuring bearing clearances with a set of plastic gauge, focused in the way that makes a person forget everything outside the radius of the thing they're attending to. When he finally noticed her, he straightened up, which she waved off. Don't stop on my account, she said. I just wanted to see. He went back to the measurement, but he was aware of her now, in the way you're aware of someone watching you do something that matters. She moved slowly around the perimeter of the bay, looking at the cataloged parts, the notebook entries copied onto the whiteboard he'd set up on the far wall with measurements and sequences and a rough timeline. You have a system, she said. More or less. She came and stood on the other side of the engine stand. In different clothes, she looked less like the CEO of a performance engineering company than she usually did. She'd been here late for something else, he guessed, and had traded whatever she normally wore to meetings for something more casual. She was in her mid-40s, dark hair, with the particular combination of composure and alertness that Ethan associated with people who had learned very early that the room doesn't wait. The frame assessment, she said. Marcus came to look at it. I heard. A pause. He didn't say you were wrong. He didn't say I was right either. No. She looked at the block. Where are the heads? Machine shop in Fort Worth. Gerald Pruitt. He does the best surface work in the state for this era of engine. How'd you find him? My father used him. He said it the way you say things that are true and significant without wanting to make them into a moment. He's 70 now. Doesn't advertise. She nodded. She picked up a valve lifter from the parts shelf, gently, understanding instinctively that you don't pick up machined engine components and manhandle them, and turned it over in her fingers, looking at the surface. These are the original lifters? They are. Heat damage is cosmetic. The geometry is good. She put it back carefully. What's the hardest part? She asked. The thing you're most worried about. He thought about it for a moment. He could have given her an easy answer. The carburetors, the intake sourcing, the head gasket selection. Those were all true worries, but she was asking something more direct than that. The engine has to start, he said. Has to start and run correctly. Not just run, correctly, the way it's supposed to. This car, the six-pack set up on the 4.4. Oh, that's a specific calibration. 3 carburetors working together in sequence. The center carb at idle, the outer 2 coming in under load. You get that calibration wrong and the engine runs, but it doesn't run right. And you can have all the correct parts in the world and still get the calibration wrong if you don't know what you're listening for. Listening for, she said, there's a sound a correctly tuned six-pack makes under acceleration. Not loud, not dramatic. But if you know it, you know it. If it's not right, it's not right, and no amount of numbers will hide that. She was quiet for a moment. And you know that sound, I've heard it, he said, a long time ago. My father had one. Not as nice as this one, but same engine family. I was maybe 12. He let me sit in it while he tuned it. He looked at the engine stand. I remember what it sounded like when it was right. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the car, stripped down and in pieces, the shell of it sitting in the middle of the bay with the half-reassembled sense of something in the process of becoming. Okay, she said. Then she said it again, softer. Okay. She left without saying goodnight, which wasn't rudeness. It was a quality she had of not performing things she didn't feel. He'd noticed it in the meeting, that same quality. She could have said something warmly conclusive before she went. She chose not to. He went back to the bearing clearances. The parts were the problem, and they always were. This was the part of restoration that movies and television skip over because it is almost entirely unglamorous and involves a great deal of time on the phone and a great deal of waiting and a not insignificant amount of frustration. The correct original air cleaner assembly for a 70 RT with the six-pack, a specific cast iron oval with the correct snorkel orientation, didn't exist in any supply house in Texas. He found one at an estate sale in Indiana through an online listing that could have been genuine or could have been someone selling him a piece off a different year car with different dimensions, and the only way to know was to buy it and find out. He bought it. 3 days later it arrived and was correct. Small victory. The intake manifold was harder. An original Edelbrock unit for the six-pack application, and a condition that would pass scrutiny from someone who knew what they were looking at, was not abundant. He called 6 suppliers and 3 private collectors. One of them, a man in Albuquerque who had been sitting on a substantial collection of Mopar parts for 20 years, had one. It was in good shape cosmetically and dimensionally sound, but there was a hairline crack in one of the runner passages that required repair before it could go on the engine. Ethan talked the man down on price by $300 on that basis and had it shipped. He repaired the crack himself over 2 evenings, using a technique he'd learned for cast aluminum repair that most shops wouldn't bother with because it was fiddly and time-consuming, but that, done correctly, produced a repair that was essentially invisible and fully structural. The carburetors were sourced through a man named Manny Delgado in Tucson, who had been building and rebuilding vintage Holleys and Carters for 35 years and who operated out of a shop that was, by all descriptions, an organized chaos of carburetor parts that only Manny could navigate. Ethan sent him the original carbs with a detailed description of what was needed. Manny called back 2 days later. The center carb's rebuildable, Manny said. The outers, the throttle shafts are worn out where the heat got them, and I can't find new shafts for these specific units, so you've got a decision. I can make shafts. It'll take me 2-3 days. Or I can source complete replacement units, but getting units that match the date codes on your center carb is going to take time. How much time? To find exact date code matches? Could be weeks, maybe more. Ethan looked at his timeline. Make the shafts, he said. Thought you'd say that. Manny didn't seem bothered by it. I'll need the center carb dimensions to match the shaft diameter on the outers. Send me the measurements. The heads came back from Gerald on day 14. Ethan drove to Fort Worth to pick them up personally rather than having them shipped, which was a decision that raised an eyebrow from Sandra when he mentioned he'd be driving 4 hours round trip for a car part. But Ethan trusted machine work to shipping boxes about as much as he trusted strangers with his daughter. You didn't let someone else carry the things that mattered. Gerald's shop was in an industrial area off the highway, tucked between a welding supply house and a tire distributor, with a handwritten sign in the window that had been there since at least 1994 and might have been older. Gerald himself was a small man with very white hair and hands that were still steady in the way that said his hands were going to be steady until they weren't, and that day hadn't come yet. He had the heads on the bench when Ethan arrived and walked him through the work without Ethan having to ask. Surface ground back to within 0.005. Valve seats examined, 2 replaced on the driver's side head where the heat had affected the seat hardness. Valve guides checked and measured, 2 oversized on the passenger side head where wear had taken them out of tolerance. These were good heads before, Gerald said. Well cared for. The original owner knew what he was doing. He paused. Or paid someone who did. The original restoration was done in the 70s, Ethan said. Calvin, the owner, said his father helped him with some of it. Gerald looked at the heads. That explains the guides. Hand-lapped valves. You don't see that anymore. No. Shame. He packaged the heads in foam and a wooden crate that he built himself, which Ethan loaded into the back of his truck. On the drive back, he stopped for coffee and called home to check on Lily, who had a book report due and wanted Ethan to confirm that a raccoon counted as a wild animal for the purposes of the report's definition. Absolutely a wild animal, he said. Okay, even if it was eating Grandma's birdseed? Definitely. Is the car getting better? Getting there, he said. Good, Lily said. Keep going. He drove the rest of the way back with the heater on and the radio off, running engine assembly sequences in his head. Day 17. The engine went back together over the course of 4 days. This is the part where Ethan's process diverged most visibly from what the engineering team would have done, which was not that their process would have been wrong. It would have been thorough and instrumented and methodical. It's that Ethan's process layered the instrumentation with something else. He assembled with correct torque sequences, obviously. The notebook had torque specifications for every major fastener, some from the factory service manual, some from his father's notes where they diverged in ways that experience had proven correct. He measured clearances. He verified his measurements. He did all of that. But he also assembled slowly. He handled each component more than necessary, in the way that is hard to justify to someone watching if they haven't done it long enough to understand. You pick up a connecting rod and feel its weight and the way it wants to settle in your hand. You run your thumb along the journal's surface. You listen when you torque a fastener because the sound tells you something about the seating. None of this is in the service manual. All of it is real. The engine was together on day 21. He looked at it on the stand and ran through the assembly in his head one more time. He did this 3 times before he was satisfied, and even then he found one thing. An external oil fitting that he wanted to replace with a new one rather than the original, because the original had a hairline fracture in the hex he hadn't noticed before. That sent him back to his parts inventory and cost him 2 hours. Calvin Rhodes appeared in the bay on day 22. He didn't say anything at first. He stood outside the East Bay entrance for a while before coming in, as if he was deciding something. Then he walked in and stood in the middle of the space and looked at the car. Frame repaired, body back together, fresh paint on the replaced floor pan sections, exterior stripped and prepped, but not yet repainted. And the engine on the stand, assembled, and waiting. "Can I look at it?" Calvin said. "Sure," Ethan said. Calvin walked to the engine stand. He stood in front of the 440 for a moment, and then he did something Ethan had not expected. He put his hand on the block, just rested his palm against the cast iron surface. He stood there for a long moment with his hand on the engine. "My father and I rebuilt this engine in 1984, Calvin said. He wasn't talking to Ethan exactly, more to the room. "We didn't know what we were doing, really. We had a book, made mistakes, had to do parts of it twice, took us almost a year." He was quiet. "He died in 1991, and this car, I've driven it maybe 8 times since then. Couldn't stand to sell it, couldn't stand to drive it, put it in storage and paid the insurance, and that was about all I could do with it." He took his hand off the block. He looked at Ethan. "How is it?" Calvin said. "Honest answer? Please." "The engine's right. The bodywork's right. The frame is better than anyone expected. Marcus will tell you himself when he looks at the current measurements." Ethan paused. "I've got 8 days. I'm going to make it." Calvin looked at him for a moment. "I hope so," he said. And then, "Not for the money, not for the company. I want you to understand that." "I do understand that," Ethan said. Calvin nodded once. He looked at the car one more time, at the shell of it waiting, at the engine waiting, at the whole unfinished state of it. Then he walked out. The body came back from the paint shop on day 25. Sterling's body shop was in the adjacent building, and the painter, a woman named Rita Chavez, who had been doing automotive paint since before Ethan started walking, had taken the car's condition personally. She'd been given a color code and a requirement for correct period formula paint. And what came back was not just correct, it was extraordinary. The Hemi Orange sat on the car the way it had in 1970, before age and sunlight and time did what they do to everything. It was the particular orange that Dodge had used for exactly 3 years and then moved on from, and in the afternoon light coming through the bay windows, it looked almost alive. Ethan stood looking at it for a moment before he let himself get back to work. He had 5 days. He did not have 5 days, which was a different thing than the calendar said. He had 5 days by the numbers and by the actual work still remaining: engine in, transmission in, fuel system, electrical, final assembly, tuning. He had approximately 5 days if nothing went wrong. He knew better than to assume nothing would go wrong. The engine went into the car on day 26, and that was the last thing that went smoothly. The transmission, a correct 4-speed manual, sourced with significant difficulty from a private collector in Mississippi, went in on day 27, and when it did, the shifter linkage was wrong. Not wrong in the way that meant it wouldn't work, wrong in the way that meant it wasn't correct, which for this car and this restoration were the same problem. The shifter throw was too long. The feel was off. He pulled the linkage, measured, compared to his notes. The issue was in the rod that connected the transmission to the floor shifter. It was the right diameter and the right material, but the length was off by 1/4 inch, which was enough to change the geometry. He could not source a correct replacement rod in 2 days. He made one. He pulled a length of correct spec bar stock from the supply room, measured it against his specifications 3 times, and cut it. Then he machined the end fittings himself, using the lathe in the main shop that he had permission to use after hours. He had not used that particular lathe often enough for it to be natural to him, and he made 2 bad cuts before he made 2 good ones, and it was 2 in the morning by the time the rod was finished and installed. He drove home and slept for 3 hours. He was back by 6. The fuel system went in on day 28. Tank, lines, filter, mechanical pump. The cooling system. The belts. He installed the exhaust manifolds and the exhaust system in stages, checking clearances at each stage. He installed the fresh wiring harness, a correct reproduction piece that had taken 11 days to arrive and had been worth the wait because reproductions for this application ranged from adequate to genuinely terrible, and this one was as close to the original as he had found. Day 29. He installed the distributor, set the initial timing, installed the rebuilt carburetors, Manny Delgado's work, which Ethan unwrapped from the packaging with the care he'd have given something that cost 5 times what it did, because Manny's work was the kind that reminded you that real craftsmanship existed in unglamorous forms. He hung the battery, connected it, added fluids. He stood back and looked at the assembled engine in the car. The 3 air cleaners sat on the carburetors, and the engine bay looked, for the first time in 30 days, like something that might run. There was a part of his brain that wanted to try it right then. That same part of his brain told him to wait, that attempting a first start on a rebuilt engine at 10 at night when he'd been working for 15 hours was asking for something to go wrong in a way he wasn't sharp enough to catch. He went home. He slept for 5 hours. He came back in the early morning, before anyone else was there, when the building was quiet and the bay was his. He had 1 day left. The engine did not start. He cranked it. Nothing. He checked his fuel delivery. Pump pressure was good. He could smell fuel at the carbs. He checked his electrical connections. He checked his timing. He cranked it again. Nothing. He stood there in the quiet of the empty bay with the starter motor's sound fading out and the silence rushing back in, and he did not allow himself to feel what was trying to happen in his chest, which was the very specific and very bad feeling of having been wrong. He pulled the notebook from his back pocket. He opened it to the pages where his father had written about a similar engine. Not identical, not the same car, but the same family. The 440 big block in a similar application. His father's cramped handwriting in pencil that had faded in places and been traced over in others to keep it legible. He read it slowly. Then he closed the notebook and put it in his pocket, and stood with his hands in his pockets looking at the engine for a long time. He thought about what Calvin had said. My father and I rebuilt this engine in 1984, made mistakes, did parts of it twice. He thought about his daughter's voice. I think you can fix anything. He thought about the sound his father's car had made when it was right. Not a sound that had ever been written down anywhere. A sound that lived only in his memory, in the part of memory where things from childhood are stored in the body rather than the brain. He picked up his timing light. He was going to have to do this the old way. Twas. He worked through the night. Small adjustments. Minute corrections to the ignition timing, to the carburetor calibration, to the idle mixture screws on each of the 3 carbs in sequence. He cranked the engine repeatedly and each time listened to the quality of the sound. Not just whether it started or didn't start, but the quality of the cranking, the way the engine responded to each successive attempt, what it was telling him about what it still needed. There is a philosophy embedded in this kind of work that has no official name and has never been written down systematically. It is roughly as follows. Every mechanical system has a state of correctness that it is trying to reach, and your job as the mechanic is not to force it there, but to remove the obstacles. The engine does not need you to make it run, it needs you to stop preventing it from running. Around 2 in the morning, he made an adjustment to the accelerator pump timing on the center carburetor that was so small, a quarter turn of the adjustment screw, that he almost dismissed it as negligible. But something in the pattern of his observations over the preceding 4 hours had led him to it the way a river leads to a particular bend in its channel, and he made the adjustment and stepped back. He cranked the engine. The 440 fired. It stumbled for a moment, caught, stumbled, caught again, and then settled into an idle that was rough and uncertain, the way an engine is when it's not yet warm and hasn't yet found itself. Ethan did not touch anything. He stood with his hands at his sides and let it run and listened. The idle roughened. He made a small adjustment to the idle mixture on the driver's side carb. The idle smoothed fractionally. He moved to the passenger side carb and made a corresponding adjustment. He waited. The idle settled. It was not perfect. It was far from the sound in his memory, the sound of his father's car when it was right. But the engine was running, and running in the way that said it was capable of becoming right. There was a note at the bottom of the idle, a particular quality of sound that only a large displacement V8 with the right internal geometry and the right state of tune makes, that told him what he needed to know. He did not call anyone. He did not celebrate in any particular way. He sat down on a step stool in the corner of the bay and looked at the car running and thought, okay, now finish it. He spent the rest of the night making adjustments. By the time the first light was showing through the bay windows, the engine was running with the particular relaxed authority of a healthy big block at idle. A sound that is entirely unlike any other sound a mechanical object makes. A sound that carries weight and age and the suggestion of enormous reserved capability. Ethan shut it down. Let it cool. Checked his fluid levels, checked for leaks, walked the engine bay one more time. Then he started it again and let it warm up properly and moved through the full tuning sequence with the engine at temperature. He was still there when Marcus Webb arrived in the morning, which was how Marcus found him, sitting on the step stool in the corner, notebook in his lap, with the hemi-orange Challenger running in the bay. Marcus stood at the entrance and listened to the engine for a long moment. "How long's it been running?" Marcus asked. "About 6 hours," Ethan said. "On and off." Marcus walked in. He stood in front of the car and listened. He was not a man who was easily impressed, and he was not allowing himself to be effusive about this, but something in his posture changed very slightly in the way that happens when a professional hears something done correctly. "The 6-pack, Marcus said. "Yes, sir." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "You get that timing right by ear." "By ear and by feel," Ethan said, "and by my father's notes." Marcus looked at the notebook in Ethan's lap. Then he looked at the engine. Then he looked at Ethan. "Tomorrow morning," Marcus said. 8 o'clock. Everybody's going to be out front." "I know," Ethan said. Marcus left. Ethan sat on the step stool a while longer, listening to the engine run in the empty bay, in the morning light coming through the high windows. He had a lot of things to feel, and most of them would have to wait. He picked up the notebook and opened it to the last entry his father had made, a small note about a 440 he'd worked on in the winter of 2003, about the particular difficulty of getting the 6-pack calibration right in cold weather, about the patience it required. At the bottom of that page, in writing that had faded until it was almost invisible, his father had written, "The car knows. Listen to it." Ethan closed the notebook. He put it in his back pocket. He went back to work. The engine was still warm when Ethan finally left the bay that morning. He'd shut it down at 7:40, checked the fluid levels one last time, walked around the car twice with the kind of attention that had nothing to do with finding things wrong and everything to do with settling himself after a night that had taken more out of him than he'd anticipated. Then he'd locked the bay, driven home, showered, eaten half a bowl of cereal standing over the sink, and driven back. He was at his workbench by 9:15. This was the nature of the work at this stage. Not the dramatic all-nighter, not the single defining moment, but the 1,000 smaller things that needed doing before the car was actually finished. The engine running was not the same as the car being ready. Anyone who had never done this kind of work could be forgiven for thinking otherwise. Ethan had no such confusion. He pulled his checklist from the notebook and went through it methodically. The cooling system needed to be bled properly. Air pockets in the cooling passages of a big block engine were not something you left to chance, because an air pocket that migrated to the wrong place at the wrong time would cause localized overheating that could undo weeks of machine work in a matter of minutes. He'd done an initial fill and bleed the previous evening, but he wanted to run the engine through a full heat cycle with the heater on and the thermostat open and watch what the temperature gauge did. He started the car, let it idle. The temperature climbed normally through the first few minutes, cold coolant warming up, thermostat still closed. And then at around 160, the thermostat opened, and he watched the gauge carefully. It stabilized at 190, which was correct for this application. He watched it hold there for 20 minutes, making small adjustments to the idle as the engine reached full operating temperature and the calibration he'd set overnight shifted fractionally with the heat. He noted the idle speed a little high. He adjusted the idle stop screw on the center carburetor. Better, he was doing this. Was literally crouched in front of the carburetor with a small screwdriver making the adjustment when he heard footsteps. Not dress shoes this time. Work boots. He turned around. It was Derek Holt, one of the junior engineers from Marcus's department. 26 years old, Stanford degree in mechanical engineering, had been at Sterling for about 18 months. Ethan knew him well enough to nod at in the hallway and not much else. Derek had the particular confidence of someone who was genuinely talented and had not yet had enough experience to understand what talent alone couldn't do. He was standing at the bay entrance with his hands in his pockets, looking at the car, looking at the engine running. His expression was doing something complicated. "Is that the original engine?" Derek asked. "Yes," Ethan said. Derek walked in slowly. He stood to the side of the car and listened to it idle. He didn't say anything for a moment, which was not what Ethan expected from him. "The report said the block was probably compromised," Derek said. "The report was working from visual assessment." "I know." A pause. "I wrote part of the report." Ethan looked at him. Derek was looking at the engine, not at Ethan, with the expression of someone who is revising something in real time. "The torque box section," Derek said. "I assessed that." "I know. You were working from the photographs." "Yeah." He was quiet. "Marcus told me about your frame measurements, the driver's side forward rails." "What did he say?" "Said they were better than what we reported." Derek finally looked at Ethan. He didn't seem happy about it. "He doesn't need to be happy about it," Ethan said. "He just needs to know it." Derek was quiet for a moment, watching the engine idle. There was something working in him, some adjustment being made that was taking more effort than the technical question warranted. "How did you know?" Derek asked. "Without instruments." Ethan thought about how to answer that. He could feel the screwdriver still in his hand, and he was still watching the temperature gauge out of the corner of his eye, and there was part of him that wanted to give a short answer and get back to work. But something about Derek's question, the genuine quality of it, the fact that it wasn't challenging him but actually asking, made him take a moment. "You know how metal sounds when you tap it?" Ethan said. "Depending on what's under it." Derek nodded. Every engineer knew that, at least in theory. It's like that, but with your hands. After you've done it long enough, you start to feel things in the metal that don't show up until later in more precise measurements. It's not mystical. It's just pattern recognition that lives in your hands instead of your head. He paused. The instruments confirm it. They don't replace the initial read. Derek looked at the engine for a moment. I've never worked on a car this old, he said. The old stuff. I know the theory, but I don't have the hands for it. Theory's not nothing, Ethan said. No, Derek said, but it's not everything either. He said it like a man who was conceding something he'd been privately disputing with himself for a while. He left shortly after. Ethan watched him go, then turned back to the temperature gauge. 190. Holding steady. He reached in and made the idle adjustment. On day 10, Vanessa called him into her office. This was sufficiently unusual. She hadn't summoned him to her office. She'd come to the bay. That he spent the elevator ride up trying to determine what he'd done wrong. He couldn't identify anything. That did not particularly comfort him. Her office was on the third floor and had a window that looked out over the main yard, where you could see the parking lot and the corner of the east wing that had been damaged in the fire. The repair work on the building itself was moving faster than the car. Contractors had been through twice already, and the collapsed section of the roof was already framed back in. She was on the phone when he knocked. She waved him in, held up a finger. He stood near the door and didn't look at her desk or her papers or any of the surfaces in the room with the particular care of someone who has grown up knowing that other people's things were not his business. She finished the call. Set the phone down. Sit, she said. He sat. She looked at him for a moment with the particular quality of attention she had that made him feel like she was running through several versions of this conversation before she started it. I need to ask you something, she said. And I need you to be honest with me, not professionally honest, actually honest. Okay, he said. Day 1, in the conference room, when you said 30 days. She paused. Were you certain, or were you hoping? He considered the question seriously. Both, he said. She looked at him. Explain that. I was certain enough to say it. I wasn't certain enough to not be scared saying it. He paused. I'd looked at the car for a few hours. I had a read on the frame that I believed, but I hadn't gotten into the engine yet, hadn't done real assessment on the body damage. So, certain in the way that I knew there was a real chance. Not certain in the way that I'd have bet my daughter's future on it. Not at that point. She was quiet for a moment. What would you bet on it now? He thought about the engine idling in the bay, the temperature holding at 190, the bearing clearances he'd measured and remeasured, the heads that Gerald Pruitt had given back to him better than they'd gone in. More, he said. She nodded once. She seemed to accept this as the full and actual answer, which it was. I'm going to be honest with you too, she said. When you came into that meeting, my first response was to want you out of it, not because I thought you were wrong. I didn't know enough at that point to have an opinion about the technical question. I wanted you out because of what it would do to the dynamic if you were wrong. If we gave you 30 days and it failed, that's a problem I'd have to manage. I would rather have had a clean decision and moved on. Ethan said nothing. What changed my mind, she said, was that you didn't try to impress anyone. You said what you thought was true. You acknowledged that you couldn't be completely certain, and you asked for the chance to prove it. That's rarer than it should be, she paused. I also noticed you didn't ask for anything extra. No extra staff, no budget request beyond what the parts would cost, no special accommodations. I didn't need extra staff, he said, and I didn't want the overhead. The overhead. More people means more explaining. More explaining means more time not working on the car. He said it simply, not as a complaint about the engineering team or an assertion of superiority, just as a fact about how he worked. She looked at him for a moment with an expression that was somewhere between professional appraisal and something more personal, and then she seemed to make a decision and set it aside. What do you need for the next 2 weeks, she said. I've got a fuel system concern I want to resolve before I do any road testing. The tank was cleaned and sealed, but I want to pull the sending unit and inspect it before I trust the gauge. And I want to go through the brake system again. The master cylinder was replaced before the fire, but I don't have documentation of what was used, and I want to verify it's correct for the application. What else? The rubber. He meant the weather seals, the door seals, the windshield seal. All of the rubber components that deteriorate and are often overlooked. I want correct reproduction seals throughout. I put in the request last week. I haven't seen confirmation. She picked up her phone and typed something. You'll have confirmation by end of day. Thank you. She set the phone down. Is there anything else you need that you haven't asked for? He thought about it. There was one thing. He'd been running it around in his head for a few days, uncertain whether to raise it. The road test, he said. When we get there, I'd want to do it on an empty road, not the parking lot. The six-pack needs to come off idle and load the outer carburetors under real driving conditions to calibrate correctly. You can't do that in a parking lot. Where were you thinking? There's a stretch of county road about 12 miles east. Light traffic, good surface, long straightaways. He paused. I've done test drives there before with customer cars. She nodded. Fine. He stood to go. She said, Ethan? He stopped. You know what this car means to Calvin, she said. It wasn't a question. Yes, he said. So you understand why getting it right matters more than getting it done. I understood that before I walked into the conference room, he said. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded again, and he left. He was back in the bay by noon. The fuel system work took the better part of 2 days. He pulled the sending unit, which turned out to be a replacement that was close but not quite correct for the float height, which meant the gauge would read falsely at about a quarter tank, and sourced the correct unit from his parts contact in Tulsa. He also pulled the fuel lines at every connection point and checked them individually. 3 of the line fittings had been replaced at some point in the car's history with metric fittings that had been adapted to fit. Not wrong enough to fail, but not right either, and not right was not good enough. He replaced them. The brake system was more involved. The front disc brakes, a factory option on this car, which he was grateful for because drum-only Challengers from this era required significantly more judgment calls and restoration, were in reasonable shape. The calipers had been rebuilt within the last few years based on the appearance of the boot material, and whoever had done it had used correct components. The rear drums were the question. He pulled them and found that the rear wheel cylinders had been replaced with incorrect units. A common issue with older restorations where the shop had used what was available rather than what was specified, and nobody had noticed because the brakes worked. He ordered correct cylinders and installed them. Not because the incorrect ones were dangerous, because they were incorrect. This distinction, the gap between functional and correct, was something he found himself explaining on day 13 to Derek Holt, who had started appearing in the bay in the late afternoons with what appeared to be a genuine interest in no particular agenda. Derek wasn't in the way. That was the thing Ethan noticed first. Some people who come to watch in a shop environment are unconsciously in the way. They stand where you need to be, they ask questions at the wrong moment, they touch things they shouldn't. Derek had figured out quickly that the right place to stand was along the wall, and that the right time to ask something was when Ethan's hands were not in the middle of something. They were talking about the rear wheel cylinders. Ethan had the old ones on the bench next to the new ones, and the difference was not dramatic to look at. Same general dimensions, same function. The originals are a different bore diameter, Ethan said, by about 10%. That changes the hydraulic pressure distribution between the front and rear. How much does that actually matter? Derek asked. Not defensively, genuinely asking. On the street, under normal driving? Probably not much you'd notice. But this car had a specific brake bias from the factory, more bias to the front than most cars of this era because of the weight distribution with the big block. He picked up one of the incorrect cylinders. These pushed the bias slightly toward the rear, not enough to make the brakes unsafe, enough to change how the car feels under hard braking. And that matters for a car that... Does it even get driven hard? Doesn't matter whether it will or won't, Ethan said. It matters that it's right. Calvin can decide whether to drive it hard. My job is to make sure that when he does, it behaves the way it's supposed to. Derek looked at the cylinders. When I wrote that part of the assessment, the brake system section, I noted the wheel cylinders were replaced units and flagged it as potentially incorrect, but I put it at low priority because the system was functional. Ethan looked at him. That was a reasonable call for an assessment under time pressure, he said, which he meant honestly. But not a call you'd make. Not for this job, no. Derek picked up one of the original cylinders and turned it in his hands. He was doing that thing that some people did around machined metal, feeling the surfaces, understanding the object by touch as well as by sight. It was an instinct Ethan respected. My professor in school talked about the difference between good enough and correct, Derek said. He said in engineering, good enough was always good enough until it wasn't. And the only way to know when it had stopped being good enough was when something went wrong. Your professor was right, Ethan said, but you think about it differently. I think correct is always preferable to good enough if you have the choice. And a lot of times you do have the choice. It just takes longer. He set the incorrect cylinder back on the bench. Good enough is for when you have no other option. Derek nodded. He stayed another hour watching Ethan install the correct cylinders and bleed the brake system. He didn't talk much after that, which Ethan took as a sign that he was actually processing rather than waiting for the next opportunity to engage. Sandra called him on day 15. He was in the middle of fitting the windshield seal, a process that required 3 hands in ideal conditions and 2 hands plus a lot of patience in reality, when his phone buzzed in his pocket. He finished the section he was working on before he answered, which took about 4 minutes and cost him a partial thumbnail when the seal tool slipped. He looked at the missed call and called her back. The school called, Sandra said. She had a quality of voice when she was delivering information she wasn't sure how to contextualize, a careful flatness that was the opposite of her normal tone. About Lily? A girl in her class said something to her. A pause. About you? He waited. Apparently the girl's older sister works at Sterling. She told her sister that there was a shop mechanic who was trying to fix some expensive car, and everyone thought he was going to fail. And the girl told Lily that her daddy was going to embarrass himself. Ethan stood there with his thumbnail still smarting and his windshield seal half-fitted and let that land. Is Lily okay? He said. She's Lily, Sandra said, which was its own kind of answer. She told the girl that her daddy could fix anything. Apparently she said it loud enough that the teacher heard and called me because she was concerned about conflict. Is there conflict? Not really. The girl backed down. Lily's fine. A pause. But she did ask me tonight when she got home. She asked if you were going to be okay, if the car was going to work out. He looked at the car, the windshield half sealed, the interior still to go in, 9 days left. Tell her yes, he said. Is it true? Tell her yes anyway, he said. I'll make sure it's true. Sandra was quiet for a moment. You sound tired, Ethan. I'm okay. You've said that every time I've asked for 2 weeks. Because it's been true every time, he said. And then, more honestly, I'm tired, but not the bad kind. Sandra had known him long enough, had been his wife's mother long enough, had been helping him raise Lily long enough, to know the difference between the kinds of tired he described. She didn't push it. Come home before midnight, she said. She wants to show you her book report in the morning. About the raccoon? She changed topics. Now it's about a car. He laughed. It surprised him. The sound of it in the empty bay, genuine and short. I'll be home before midnight, he said. He put the phone back in his pocket and picked up the windshield seal tool. The interior went in on days 16 and 17. This was one of the more visible parts of the restoration, which meant it was also one of the parts where mistakes were most obvious, which meant Ethan slowed down here even more than he had elsewhere. The seat upholstery had been sent to a specialist in Dallas, a woman named Carla Fuentes, who did vintage automotive interiors and who had come personally to take measurements and select the correct grain and color of vinyl before the fire had even been fully processed. Carla's work came back on day 15 and was, without exaggeration, the best interior material work Ethan had seen in years. He fitted it himself. He spent 8 hours on the driver's seat alone, not because it was complicated, but because getting the seams right on a bucket seat required care that could not be hurried. You could feel when the material was right and when it was pulling wrong, and if you installed it pulling wrong, you'd see it for the rest of the car's life every time someone sat in it. The door panels went in on day 17. The headliner, correct grain black vinyl, sourced from the same supplier as the seat material, went in on day 17 as well, late in the evening, with Derek helping to hold it in position while Ethan worked the retaining clips. Derek didn't have to be there. He was there anyway, which Ethan had stopped questioning. How do you know when the grain direction is right? Derek asked. He was holding the headliner up with both hands at a slightly awkward angle, the way someone holds something they've been asked to hold without any context for why the position matters. The grain has to run front to back, Ethan said. He was working a clip into a retaining channel near the windshield header. Factory spec. If it runs side to side, it looks wrong to anyone who knows what they're looking at. How many people know what they're looking at? In this context, Calvin does. That's enough. Derek shifted his grip slightly. Does it bother you? The level of specificity that most people wouldn't notice? No, Ethan said without having to think about it. Why not? Because I'd notice. He got the clip seated and moved to the next one. The people who care about the result don't need to know the process. That's fine, but the process still has to be right. Derek held the headliner steady and said nothing for a moment. Then, I've been in engineering meetings where we talked about what the customer would notice versus what the customer wouldn't notice. And the decision was usually based on what the customer would notice. That's a reasonable business decision, Ethan said. You don't make it that way. Different kind of work, Ethan said. He got the second clip. In a production environment, you're making decisions across thousands of units. Every compromise you make 1,000 times. The math changes. He moved to the third clip. Here I'm making a decision once, for one car, for one person. The math is different. Derek seemed to be sitting with that. Was that your father's approach? Derek asked. Ethan paused. Not a hesitation before answering. More the kind of pause that happens when a question touches something you don't talk about often. Yes, he said. Pretty much. He got the third clip. The headliner was in. Marcus Webb came to the bay on day 19 with a measuring tape and a hydraulic frame gauge that he and one of his technicians carried in and set up without asking Ethan's permission, which was fine because it was Marcus's shop and Ethan's access to it was by ongoing permission. Ethan watched them set up from across the bay where he was working on fitting the correct reproduction radio, an AM unit, as delivered on the original car, into the dashboard. Marcus spent about 90 minutes under the car with the gauge and a set of specifications that Ethan recognized as factory frame geometry tolerances for this body style. He called out measurements to his technician, who recorded them. At some point, Marcus moved to a section of the driver's side forward rail and spent additional time there, the section Ethan had flagged in the first week. When Marcus came out from under the car, he stood up and stretched his back, the way men do when they've been in a crouch longer than comfortable, and walked over to where Ethan was working. Frames within spec, he said. I know, Ethan said. He was fitting the radio mounting bracket. The driver's side forward rail. Marcus paused. Your read was right. The deformation was superficial. Core integrity is sound. Yes, sir. Marcus was quiet for a moment. His technician was packing up the equipment across the bay. I want to say something, Marcus said, and I want to say it the way I mean it, not the way it might sound. Ethan set down the bracket and looked at him. The assessment we produced on day 1, Marcus said, was the correct assessment based on the information available and the methods appropriate to that stage of a post-incident evaluation. It was not wrong. It was incomplete, because completing it would have required the kind of physical engagement with the vehicle that the assessment process doesn't typically include. He stopped. Ethan waited. What I'm saying, Marcus said, is that you had information we didn't have. Not because you're better at your job. You're not an engineer, and that's not an insult. It's a job category. You had information we didn't have because you spent 6 hours physically handling the vehicle before you walked into that meeting, and we spent 2 hours conducting a structured visual assessment. The methods produced different data sets. That's fair, Ethan said. If you're open to it, I'd want to document your method, the tactile evaluation process, not to replace instrumental assessment, as a preliminary step. Ethan looked at him. This was not what he'd expected Marcus Webb to be saying to him, and he was honest enough with himself to acknowledge that he'd been underestimating the man in certain ways. I'd be open to that, Ethan said, but I don't know how well it documents. It's mostly experience. Most things are, at some level, Marcus said. He picked up one of the radio mounting screws from the tray on the bench and turned it between his fingers in a way that was unconscious, the fidgeting of a man whose hands are always more comfortable with something in them. I came up doing prototype assembly. Before the degree, before any of this. 7 years on the floor. He set the screw down. You don't forget it, but I let the role take me away from it. Ethan didn't know what to say to that, exactly. He said, "The car will be ready on time." "I know it will," Marcus said. He said it the way you say something when you've stopped requiring proof. He left with his technician and his frame gauge, and Ethan went back to the radio bracket. Sandra brought Lily to the shop on day 21. This was not planned. Ethan had not asked for it, and Sandra had not suggested it. What happened was that Lily had asked, apparently with enough persistence and enough of the particular quality of argument that a 7-year-old with opinions can generate, whether she could please see the car that Daddy was fixing. And Sandra had weighed the available options and driven her over on a Saturday afternoon. Ethan heard them before he saw them. Lily's shoes had a squeak in the left one that she found interesting rather than annoying, and it announced her presence across a concrete floor the way a small foghorn might. He was cleaning the engine bay covers, a painstaking job involving several different brushes and cleaners, when she appeared around the bay door with Sandra behind her. Lily was wearing a yellow rain jacket despite the fact that it was not raining, because she had a relationship with that rain jacket that was not contingent on weather. She walked into the bay carefully, which was how she always moved in new places, assessing before committing. She looked at the car. The Challenger sat in the middle of the bay, fully painted, interior in, engine in, glass in. It looked for the first time in 3 weeks like a car rather than a project. The hemi-orange under the bay lights had a quality that was hard to look away from. Lily walked up to it slowly and stood in front of it. "It's really orange," she said. "It is," Ethan said. "Did you make it that color?" "The color is original. The painter matched it." She was quiet for a moment, studying the car with the particular focus she brought to things that interested her, which was the same focus she brought to books and drawings and the movements of birds and the construction of elaborate sentences. Then she said, "Can I touch it?" Ethan looked at the freshly painted surface. "Yes, gently." She reached out and placed her palm flat on the hood, very carefully, the way you'd touch something you'd been told was fragile. She held it there for a moment. "It's warm," she said. "The engine's been running, the heat transfers." She took her hand away and looked at it, then looked at the car. "Grandma said you stayed up all night." "A few nights," Ethan said. "Why?" "Because the work needed to be done." She considered this. "My teacher says that's not healthy." "Your teacher is right, mostly. But you did it anyway." "Sometimes you do things anyway," he said. "You'll figure out when." She went around the car slowly, looking at it from different angles with her hands clasped behind her back in a posture that he couldn't remember her being taught. She stopped at the rear and looked at the twin exhaust tips, and then at the painted spoiler, and then at the trunk. She came back around to the front and looked at it again. "It looks like it wants to go somewhere," she said. Sandra made a small sound from the doorway. Ethan looked at his daughter. "Yeah," he said. "It does." "Did you give it a name?" "Not yet." She thought about it. She squinted slightly, which was what she did when she was thinking hard. "It should have a name that means it came back," she said. "Like a name about coming back." "What would that be?" "I don't know. You should think about it." She looked at him. "You have 9 days left, right?" "8 now." "That's enough," she said, with the easy certainty that he'd heard on the phone 2 weeks ago. The certainty that cost her nothing because she had not yet learned to count the cost of it. He drove them home that evening and ate dinner with them for the first time in nearly 2 weeks. Sandra's pot roast that had been in a slow cooker all day, which was the kind of food that tasted like something you'd needed for a long time without realizing it. Lily explained her new book report subject in detailed terms, which involved a significant amount of information about a 1969 Camaro that she had apparently researched with Sandra's help. "You didn't have to research muscle cars for a book report," Ethan said. "I know," she said, "but I wanted to understand your job better." She took a bite of her roll. "A Camaro is not as good as your car, by the way." "I decided." "Why not?" The Dodge is oranger, she said. He drove back to the shop after dinner. Vanessa found him at the bay on day 23. He knew she'd been coming to the bay in the evenings. He'd seen the small signs of it, a moved stool, the coffee cup that he hadn't left on the workbench. He didn't know if she came while he was there and stayed out of view, or came when he was gone, but she was watching the project in a way that went beyond administrative oversight, and she wasn't hiding that fact exactly, just not announcing it. This time, she came in directly. The car was more complete than it had been. Interior fully in, glass in, seals fitted, engine bay detailed and covered. She walked to the driver's side and looked through the window at the interior, at Carla Fuentes' seat upholstery, the correct door panels, the restored dash with its original gauges, and the period-correct radio. It's nearly done, she said. Week of detailing left, and the road test. She looked at the dash. The gauges are original? Sent them to a specialist in Scottsdale. He restores vintage instruments, all electric, the speedometer, the tach, the oil pressure gauge. They're all reading correctly now. He also sourced the correct clock movement. She was quiet for a moment. How much of what you've done here, how much of it was in the original restoration plan, before the fire? Some of it, but the fire. The fire exposed things that needed doing that the original plan would have missed. The rear wheel cylinders, a couple of the fuel line fittings. The wiring harness had a section near the firewall that had a splice repair done incorrectly at some point, probably decades ago. We replaced it with a clean run. So in some ways, she said slowly, the fire made the restoration more thorough. Ethan paused. He hadn't put it that way to himself before. In some ways, he said, if you want to find the optimistic read. She turned from the car and looked at him directly. This was something she did, a quality of directness in her gaze that some people found uncomfortable, like it didn't leave anywhere to retreat to. Do you? She asked. Find the optimistic read? Usually, he said. Not always first, but usually. She nodded. Then she said something he hadn't expected. My father had a car like this, she said. Not the same model, but same era. Big block, loud, impractical. A pause. He couldn't keep it. We needed the money from it when I was about 11, and he sold it, and that was the right call. But he talked about it for the rest of his life. She looked at the Challenger. When I saw Calvin's face that morning after the fire, I recognized the expression. It's not about the car, really. It's about the time. Yes, Ethan said. Can you give that back? The time? He looked at the car. No, he said. But I can give him the object that holds the memory. That's what I can do. She was quiet for a long moment. 8 days, she said. 7 now, he said. It's past midnight. She looked at him. Go home, Ethan. In a little while. She left, and he stayed another 2 hours, working in the quiet of the bay with the orange car in the center of it, and the building otherwise empty around him. He thought about what Lily had said, a name that means it came back. He opened the notebook and wrote something at the top of a clean page. He looked at it for a moment. Then he closed the notebook and got back to work. 7 days felt like a different thing than 8. Ethan couldn't have explained that mathematically, and he didn't try. It was just a fact of how certain numbers sit in your chest differently than others. 8 days had felt workable. 7 days felt like the walls had moved in slightly, not enough to panic about, enough to notice. He was back in the bay by 6:30 the morning after Vanessa had told him to go home. He'd slept 4 hours, which was becoming a kind of baseline. Not enough to feel rested, enough to function at the level the work required. He'd learned in the past 3 weeks to distinguish between the kinds of tired that compromised judgment and the kinds that just made everything feel heavier. So far, he was still in the second category. He was monitoring that. The detailing work was not glamorous and it was not fast. Detailing on a restoration of this caliber was not the same thing as washing a car. It was the work of making every surface, every piece of exterior chrome, every inch of engine bay metal, every rubber seal and plastic lens and painted surface look the way it was supposed to look. Not better than original, not showroom enhanced. Correct. The way it had looked in the fall of 1970 when it rolled out of the Hamtramck plant and onto a transport truck. He spent the first 2 hours on the engine bay. This was a particular skill set that overlapped with, but was not the same as mechanical restoration. You were working with cleaning agents and detailing clay and very specific brushes in very specific sequences, getting into the corners of the firewall where decades of road grime had accumulated, even through the restoration, cleaning the surfaces of the block without damaging the machined finishes that Gerald Pruitt's shop had put on it. He worked from the top down and from the outside in, methodically, the way he did everything. By 9 o'clock, the engine bay looked the way it was supposed to look. Not perfect. There was a scratch on the driver's side valve cover that he was going to have to address with a careful touch-up, and the correct orange block paint had a slightly different sheen in two spots where the heat from the fire had affected the metal surface underneath in a way that didn't show structurally but showed cosmetically, but correct. The kind of correct that a knowledgeable person would look at and say, yes, that's right. He photographed everything, which he'd been doing throughout the restoration. Not for the project file, though those went there too. He had his own record in his phone, hundreds of photographs organized by date and component, a visual accounting of what had been done and how. He'd been doing this on restoration since smartphones made it easy, and he'd never once regretted a photograph but had several times been grateful for one. He was on his knees working on the driver's side rocker panel when Derek appeared. "You're here early," Derek said. "Always," Ethan said. Derek sat on the step stool without being invited, which had stopped being something he asked about around day 15. He had coffee. He offered Ethan a cup, which Ethan accepted. "I've been thinking about something," Derek said. "Okay." "The carburetor calibration, the six-pack." He paused. "Can I watch the road test?" Ethan sat back and drank the coffee. "Why?" "I've never seen a correctly tuned six-pack under actual driving conditions. I've read about it. I want to hear what you described. The sound when it's right." Ethan looked at him. Derek had the expression of someone who was genuinely asking rather than positioning himself for something. "If Vanessa clears it," Ethan said. "I already asked her." "What did she say?" "She said it was your call." Ethan drank his coffee. "Fine," he said. "But you ride in the back." Derek looked at the car. "It has a back seat?" "It has something that functions as one," Ethan said. The chrome work took day 24 entirely. This was one of the most visible elements of the exterior: the bumpers front and rear, the window trim, the door handles, the exterior mirrors. And it was also one of the most unforgiving, because bad chrome work on a restoration like this was immediately visible to anyone who knew what they were looking at. The chrome had been sent out weeks earlier to a shop in Oklahoma City that specialized in vintage automotive chrome and had been delivered back on day 18. Fitting it was an exercise in patience because each piece had to be aligned precisely before any fastener was tightened, and achieving correct alignment required checking, adjusting, rechecking. Vanessa came by at 3 in the afternoon while he was fitting the rear bumper. She didn't say anything for a while. She had developed the quality of being present without demanding attention, which Ethan had noticed and appreciated without commenting on. "The chrome came back well," she said finally. "The shop in Oklahoma City does good work," he said. He was torquing the driver's side bumper bracket. "I've used them before." Personal referral again. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. He finished the bracket and moved to the passenger side. "Ethan," she said, "I need to give you some information about tomorrow." He paused. "What about tomorrow?" "Calvin is coming. He knows it's not day 30 yet. We have 6 days left, but he wanted to see the progress. I told him you were in the final stage." "That's fine," Ethan said. "It's not just Calvin." She said it in a way that meant there was more. "He's bringing someone." Ethan waited. "His son," Vanessa said. "James. He's 32. The relationship between them is complicated. James didn't know the car existed until the fire. Calvin kept it private." She paused. "I don't fully know the dynamic. Calvin doesn't talk about it in detail. But whatever the situation is, he wanted James to see the car." Ethan thought about Calvin's hand on the block. "My father and I rebuilt this engine in 1984. He thought about what Vanessa had told him earlier, the time embedded in the object. "I understand," he said. I wanted you to know so you weren't surprised. She looked at the bumper he was fitting. How does it look to you, overall? He sat back and looked at the car. Bumper half on, chrome gleaming even in the imperfect light of the bay. The hemi-orange paint. The black interior visible through the window. The engine sitting in there, quiet now, knowing what it could do. It looks like what it is, he said. Which is? A 70 Challenger RT with the 446 pack. The way it's supposed to look. He picked up his torque wrench. Not like something that was in a fire, sus. Calvin arrived the next morning at 10 with a man who was recognizably his son in the way that sons often resemble fathers in the structure of the face while wearing the expression differently. James Rhodes was lean where Calvin was broad, and he had a quality of wariness about him that was not hostility exactly, but was the posture of someone who had learned to come to situations braced. Ethan met them at the bay door. Calvin shook his hand. James nodded. He was looking past Ethan at the car. Let me show you where we are, Ethan said. He walked them through it the way he'd walk anyone through it, starting at the front, moving around the exterior, then opening the hood. He explained what had been done and in what sequence. He didn't editorialize, and he didn't emphasize things for effect. He just described the work. Calvin listened with his full attention. James started with his arms crossed, which was a posture Ethan recognized as not quite ready, and slowly, over the course of the walkthrough, let them come down. When they reached the engine bay, Calvin put his hand on the block again. Same gesture as before, his palm flat on the cast iron. Gerald Pruitt resurfaced the heads, Ethan said. Calvin looked up. The machinist in Fort Worth? You know him? Of him. He was the man to see 30 years ago. Still is, Ethan said. Calvin nodded. He looked at the engine for a long time without speaking. James came to stand beside him and looked at the engine too, and there was a moment, brief, not dramatized, where father and son were standing side by side looking at the same thing without any of the complicated architecture of whatever stood between them getting in the way. James said quietly, You really rebuilt this from scratch. Not from scratch, Ethan said. That's the point. Most of it's original. We saved more than anyone expected. James looked at him. The report said it was a total loss. The initial assessment, yes. But you disagreed. I had reason to, Ethan said. James studied him for a moment with an expression that was trying to be skeptical and wasn't quite getting there. Why'd you take this on? Knowing how it looked? Walking into a room full of engineers and... Because I looked at the car before I walked into the room, Ethan said. Not after. James was quiet for a second. Then he said, Is that how you do everything? Look first? When I can, Ethan said. James nodded slowly. He looked at the engine again. There was something working in him that Ethan wasn't going to speculate about because it was not his to speculate about. He just let it be there. Calvin said without looking away from the engine, Can we hear it run? Yes, sir, Ethan said. He started the car. The 440 fired immediately. No hesitation, no stumble, straight into a smooth idle that settled within 10 seconds to the number he'd calibrated it to. The sound in the enclosed bay was significant without being violent, a low, unhurried authority that made the air in the space feel heavier. James stepped back slightly when it started, not in alarm, more the instinctive response of a person who hasn't been around large displacement engines and didn't anticipate the physical presence of the sound. Calvin stood with his eyes closed for about 5 seconds. When he opened them, they were bright in a way that had nothing to do with the fluorescent lights. Ethan shut the engine down and gave them time in the bay without following them, moving to his workbench and occupying himself with the detail work that remained on the interior, while Calvin and James walked around the car and spoke in voices too low for him to hear. He was not trying to hear. He kept his back mostly to them and let the conversation be private. After about 20 minutes, Calvin came to the workbench. Ethan, he said. Ethan turned. I don't have the words, Calvin said. And then he stopped, which was itself a kind of statement from a man who had spent 61 years accumulating the words for most things. 5 more days, Ethan said. It'll be right. Calvin nodded. He looked like he wanted to say something else, and then decided not to. He looked at the notebook on the workbench instead, open to the current page covered in Ethan's cramped handwriting. "Your father's?" Calvin said. "Started out as his," Ethan said. "I took it over." Calvin looked at it for a moment. "You never mentioned him." "You never asked." Calvin almost smiled. "Fair enough." He looked at Ethan. "Was he a mechanic?" "He was whatever the job required," Ethan said. "Shop work mostly. He could do anything with an engine." Past tense. "He died when I was 22, Ethan said. "Heart attack. No warning." Calvin received this quietly. "I'm sorry," he said. "Thank you," Ethan said, because that was the correct response, and because he meant it. Calvin left with James, and Ethan watched them go from the bay door, father and son walking across the parking lot, with something slightly different in the space between them than had been there when they arrived. He couldn't have said what it was. He went back to the interior detail work. Day 26 arrived with wind and the threat of rain that never quite materialized, which was the kind of weather that made the county road 12 miles east look different than it had in the dry sunshine of the past few weeks. Ethan had planned the road test for late morning, once the pavement was fully dry after the overnight dew. He wanted clean pavement. He wanted the car's behavior to be about the car, not about moisture. He'd done his pre-road test check over 2 hours the previous evening. Fluid levels, belt tensions, tire pressures. He'd ordered correct reproduction tires that were period appropriate in size and tread pattern, and had them mounted and balanced by a tire shop that understood why it mattered to do it correctly. Brake feel. Lights, horn. He'd taken the car up and down the parking lot twice just to feel the brake pedal and the steering before committing to a public road. Derek showed up at 9:30 in a jacket that suggested he'd taken the road test slightly more seriously than a casual observation. "You're wearing that," Ethan said. Derek looked at his jacket. "What's wrong with—" "Nothing. Get in the back." The back seat of a 1970 Challenger RT was, as Ethan had suggested, technically present. It accommodated Derek with the kind of grudging mechanical compliance that classic muscle cars extend to adult rear seat passengers, which is to say, Derek's knees were in a position they would not have chosen independently. "This is fine," Derek said. "You said you wanted to come," Ethan said. "I stand by that decision." Ethan started the car, let it warm up for 5 minutes, then pulled out of the Sterling lot. He drove the route to the county road at low speed, feeling the car, the way the steering responded, the way the brakes modulated, the way the transmission moved through gears. He was in the habit of treating every early mile of a newly restored vehicle as diagnostic, because the first miles told you things that the shop couldn't. The car felt good, not perfect. The steering had a slight heaviness at low speed that he wanted to look at, possibly a bump steer issue that would need to be addressed with the alignment, but good, solid, like something that knew what it was. He reached the county road and turned east. The road was straight for about 1.5 miles, then bent gently left, then straight again for another 2 miles. Light traffic, 2 pickups and a farm implement passed him going west in the first half-mile, then nothing. "Okay," he said, more to himself than to Derek. He held the car at 40 miles per hour, then 50. The engine was idling the center carburetor, pulling cleanly and without hesitation. He brought the speed up to 60 and held it there for half a mile. The car tracked straight and true on the flat road surface, no pull left or right. Then he put his foot down. This is the moment with a six-pack that you either get or you don't, and Ethan had been thinking about it for 26 days. Under moderate acceleration, the center two-barrel handles the fuel supply. The outer carburetors sit on their spring-loaded secondary plates, closed, waiting. When the throttle passes a certain point, and the point is calibrated by the spring tension on those secondaries, and getting that calibration right is an art that sits somewhere between measurement and feel. The outer carbs open together, and the engine's fuel supply essentially triples instantaneously. When it's calibrated correctly, the transition is seamless. You feel the power multiply, but there's no surge, no stumble, no flat spot. The engine just expands, like something drawing a deep breath. When it's not calibrated correctly, you feel a stumble or a hesitation at the transition point, the signature of the outer carbs either opening too early or too late. Ethan held his breath for the half second between the throttle going down and the outer carbs committing to open. The transition was clean. The 440 pulled hard through fourth gear. Not violent, not dramatic, just enormous and sustained and completely authoritative, the way this engine was designed to operate. The sound changed quality, deeper, fuller, the note dropping half a step as the displacement came fully alive. It was not a loud car exactly. It was a car whose sound had weight. In the back seat, Derek said something. Ethan didn't hear the words over the engine, but he heard the tone of them, which was the tone of someone who has just understood something that they previously only knew about. He backed off the throttle at 80 and let the car settle back to cruising. He made the left bend easily. He drove the next 2 miles straight and then turned around at a farm crossroad. He made 3 more acceleration runs on the way back, varying the throttle input each time. He was listening for the transition each time, clean, clean, clean. He also noticed that the stumble he'd been worried about at partial throttle in second gear was gone. Whatever adjustment he'd made to the accelerator pump timing 2 weeks ago had resolved it, or the issue had resolved itself as the engine accumulated miles and the rings seated fully. He made a note in his head. He'd verify at the end. On the last run, holding 60 and fourth, Derek put his hand out the window, the rear side window which was hinged and could be cracked, and held it in the airstream like a 7-year-old would. Ethan saw it in the mirror. "Feels fast," Derek called. "It's not that fast," Ethan said. "Relative to a dyno room, it is." Ethan almost laughed. He pulled back onto the Sterling lot and parked in front of the bay. He sat for a moment with the engine at idle, listening. He revved it twice, not for theatrics, to check the throttle return and the idle stability after the return. Idle settled at 750 revolutions per minute, exactly where he'd calibrated it. He shut it off. Derek unfolded himself from the back seat with the expression of someone who has experienced something they're going to be thinking about for a while. "The sound," Derek said. "When the outer carbs open." "Yes," Ethan said. "That's what you were listening for." "That's what I was listening for." Derek stood in the parking lot and looked at the car. "That's not in any manual." "No," Ethan said. "It's not." He found the problem that afternoon. He had been doing a final systems check, going through every electrical circuit in sequence, verifying function, which was the kind of work that was necessary and dull, and occasionally revealed something you'd rather not find, when the oil pressure gauge moved. Not in the way it was supposed to move, in a different way. He was running the engine at idle, watching the gauges, when the oil pressure reading dropped by about 12 pounds for approximately 3 seconds and then returned to normal. He watched it. It happened again. Then again, about 90 seconds later. He shut the engine off. He sat in the driver's seat for a moment with his hands on the wheel and his eyes on the gauge that now read 0 because the engine was off. He was doing arithmetic that he did not like the answer to. An intermittent oil pressure fluctuation on a freshly rebuilt engine had a finite number of causes. Some of them were minor: a sending unit that was going bad, a small air pocket in the oil passages, a new filter that hadn't fully purged. Some of them were not minor at all: a bearing that was not seating correctly, an oil pump with inconsistent output, a restriction in a passage that the rebuild had not fully cleared. He got out of the car and opened the hood. He pulled the valve covers. He looked at the rocker arms and the oil passages that fed them. Everything appeared correct. He pulled the oil filter, new, correct, and looked at it. Nothing obvious. He replaced it. He started the engine again. He watched the pressure gauge for 10 minutes. Normal, normal, normal. Then, the drop. 12 pounds, 4 seconds, returned to normal. He shut it off again and sat on his step stool and looked at the engine. The thing about an intermittent problem is that it is worse than a consistent problem in a particular way. A consistent problem can be diagnosed and addressed. An intermittent problem requires you to catch it in the act. The engine was not telling him continuously what was wrong. It was only telling him occasionally, and the intervals between tellings were not regular enough to predict. He thought about the bearing clearances he'd measured during assembly. They'd been within spec. He'd measured 3 times, recorded the numbers, checked them against the standard. But Within spec was a range, not a point. Bearing clearances toward the tight end of the specification ran with higher oil pressure under normal conditions. Bearing clearances toward the loose end ran with lower pressure. He'd been in the middle, as intended. But if one bearing journal, 1, had a clearance slightly outside the range he'd measured, possibly due to a measurement error or a seating variation as the engine broke in, that bearing would show intermittent pressure fluctuation as the oil film at that bearing momentarily failed to maintain its hydrodynamic cushion. This was a problem he could not simply adjust away. He picked up the notebook and looked at his bearing clearance records. He went through them one by one, connecting rod bearings, main bearings, cam bearings, all recorded, all within the range he'd specified. The measurements were there in his cramped pencil handwriting, each one dated and noted. He could be wrong about the measurements. That was the honest accounting. He'd measured carefully, he'd measured multiple times, but he was human and he'd been tired for parts of the assembly process. And human measurement with plastigauge, while reliable, was subject to technique error. Or the issue could be somewhere he hadn't measured. The oil pump, a passage restriction, something else entirely. He called Gerald Pruitt. Gerald answered on the 4th ring, which meant he'd been working and had to clean his hands before picking up. A fact Ethan knew because Gerald had mentioned this once, and it was the kind of detail that stayed with him. "I've got an intermittent pressure drop on the 440, Ethan said. 12 pounds at idle, 3 to 5 seconds, returns to normal. Intervals irregular." Gerald was quiet for a moment. "How many miles on it?" "About 30 since the first start." "New oil pump?" "Rebuilt. I sourced a correct unit and had it rebuilt before installation." "Spec the pump output?" "I did. It was within range." Another pause. "Run the pressure test with a mechanical gauge," Gerald said. "Not the dash gauge. The sending unit could be misreading." Ethan exhaled. He'd thought of this. The sending unit, the electronic sensor that relayed oil pressure to the dash gauge, could, in theory, be malfunctioning rather than reporting a real pressure fluctuation. It was the optimistic explanation. "I'll run it," he said. "Call me back," Gerald said. Ethan did not have a mechanical pressure gauge in the bay. He needed to pull one from the main tool supply, which required going to the supply room and signing it out, which at 6 in the evening meant finding whoever had the supply room key for after-hours access. He found a maintenance tech named Phil, who had the key and was philosophical about being pulled away from his dinner in the break room. He ran the mechanical gauge. It required threading a fitting into the oil pressure port on the block, which took 20 minutes. He started the engine, watched the mechanical gauge. Normal, normal, normal. Then, the drop. 12 pounds, 4 seconds. He shut it off and sat on the floor beside the car with his back against the rocker panel and looked at the ceiling of the bay. The sending unit was not the issue. The pressure drop was real. He called Gerald back. "Real pressure," Ethan said. Gerald made a sound that wasn't quite a word. "Which cylinder bank?" "I don't know yet." "You need to know yet," Gerald said, not unkindly. "Isolate it, pull the rocker arms on the driver's side and check the oil ports at the pedestals, then passenger side." "That's going to take me however long it takes," Gerald said. "Better to know." Ethan hung up. He looked at the clock on the wall, 6:45 in the evening, 4 days until the reveal. He pulled on his gloves. He worked through the night. This was different from the previous all-nighters, which had been about quantity, covering enough ground, getting enough done. This night was about a single problem, a diagnostic chase through a freshly rebuilt engine looking for one thing that was wrong. It had a specific, focused quality of misery that was distinct from general exhaustion. He pulled the valve covers. He pulled the rocker arms on the driver's side and inspected the oil passages at each pedestal. He used a small bore scope to look into the passages where the scope would reach. He pulled the oil supply passage plug at the back of the head and ran a thin probe through it. He was looking for a restriction, a piece of casting flash, a fragment of gasket material, a manufacturing irregularity that could cause intermittent flow disruption. He found nothing on the driver's side. He moved to the passenger side. He was 3 pedestals from the front when the probe encountered resistance that it should not have encountered. He stopped. He adjusted the angle. The probe found the same resistance in the same location. He pulled the probe and got the bore scope into the passage. At the fourth passage, the one feeding the fourth cylinder's rocker arm, there was a restriction, not a dramatic blockage, a partial one, a small fragment of casting material that had broken loose, possibly during the restoration process, possibly already present and dislodged by the heat of the fire, and had settled into the passage at an angle that partially obstructed flow. Under normal conditions, sufficient oil got through. Under the specific conditions of certain load cycles, a particular RPM range combined with a certain oil temperature, the restriction was enough to cause a pressure drop in the main gallery as the pump worked to maintain flow past the obstruction. It was, in the technical sense, a small problem. In the practical sense, it was a problem that would get worse with time and heat cycling, and if left unaddressed could eventually lead to accelerated wear on the fourth cylinder's rocker arm and ultimately to valve train damage. He looked at the restriction through the bore scope for a moment. Then he set the scope down and sat on the floor again. 4 days. He had 4 days and he had an engine that needed to come partially apart. Not completely, not back to the short block, but at minimum the passenger side head needed to come off so he could access and clear the passage from the port end. That meant undoing work he'd already done. It meant resetting the head gasket. It meant going back to Gerald for a second set of heads inspection to make sure the resurfacing had not been affected. It meant things he was not sure he had time for. He did not call anyone that night. There was no one to call at 2 in the morning who could make the decision for him. And the decision was not complicated even if it was difficult. You found a problem, you fixed the problem. That was the whole of it. The timeline was what the timeline was. He opened the notebook to a clean page and wrote out the procedure. Cylinder head removal, passenger side, passage clearing procedure. Head reinstallation. Retorque sequence, new head gasket, restart and pressure verification. He estimated the time. If he started at first light and worked without interruption, he could have the head back on by end of day. If Gerald could verify it by phone, using Ethan's measurements and bore scope photographs rather than a physical inspection, he could restart the engine by the following morning. That left 2 days for final verification and any additional issues. It was tight. It was possible. He set his alarm for 5:30 and went to his truck and slept in the cab. Marcus Webb found him at 6:15. Ethan was already inside, already had the valve cover off, already had his notes on the bench. Marcus had come in early for reasons of his own, a project deadline on a different job, and had seen the bay lights on and come to investigate. He stood at the entrance and looked at the state of the engine bay. The valve covers off, the bore scope on the bench. The notebook open with the procedure written out. "What happened?" Marcus said. Ethan told him, precisely and without editorializing. The intermittent pressure drop, the mechanical gauge confirmation, the bore scope search, the restriction in the fourth passage. Marcus listened. He walked to the bench and looked at the bore scope photographs Ethan had taken on his phone, which were not perfect quality but were clear enough. "Casting fragment," Marcus said. "That's what it looks like. Can you clear it without pulling the head?" "I've been thinking about that," Ethan said. "There's a process, compressed air through the passage, possibly with a solvent flush, that might dislodge it. But if it moves and goes into the oil system instead of coming out the clean end, I've traded a localized restriction for a traveling contaminant." "Which is worse," Marcus said. "Potentially, yes." Marcus looked at the engine. He was doing the same arithmetic Ethan had been doing. "Pull the head," he said. "That's my call too." "Do you want help?" Ethan paused. He looked at Marcus. "You know, head R and R on a 440. "I know head R and R on most things built before 1985, Marcus said. "I told you, 7 years on the floor." He set his coffee down on the workbench. "Tell me where you want me." They pulled the passenger side head together. Marcus's technique was different from Ethan's in small ways. A different sequence for the intake manifold fasteners, a different preference for the head bolt removal order, but it was competent and it was fast, which was what mattered. Having 2 sets of experienced hands reduced the time by a third. The head came off at 8:15. Ethan got into the passage from the port end with a probe and a bore scope and with careful manipulation and a compressed air blast from the block end, the casting fragment came free. He examined it, a piece of casting flash perhaps 4 millimeters long, irregular in shape, slightly darker than fresh cast iron, which suggested it had been there for some time and was not a result of the restoration. "That's been in there a while," Marcus said. "Since before the fire," Ethan said. "So the fire didn't cause it?" "No, the fire just disturbed it, moved it to a position where it could cause problems." Marcus looked at the fragment on the rag. Something moved through his expression. 30-year-old casting flash, he said. "That could have been in there the whole time and never caused an issue." "Or it would have caused an issue eventually," Ethan said, "when the car was being driven, if someone hadn't found it first." Marcus received this quietly. "We'd have missed it," he said. "The assessment team. We wouldn't have looked for that." Ethan didn't respond to that directly. He was already going back to the head surface, checking the machined face to ensure the removal had not compromised the surface. It hadn't, and reaching for a new head gasket from his parts stock. "Gerald needs to know about this," Ethan said. "I want to call him before we reinstall." "Call him," Marcus said. He was already laying out the head bolts in the sequence for reinstallation. Gerald listened to the description of the passage restriction and the clearing procedure. He asked 3 questions about the passage geometry and the bore scope images, which Ethan photographed and texted to him. Gerald looked at them. There was a silence on the phone while he did, and then said, "The bore looks clean. You cleared it completely." "That's my read too. Use a new head gasket. Torque sequence standard for that application. Run it 10 minutes, let it fully warm, shut it down, and retorque." Gerald paused. "This is not an unusual finding on a casting of this age. You did the right thing." "Thank you, Gerald." "Let me know how it runs," Gerald said, and hung up. The head went back on. The torque sequence took 40 minutes because Ethan did it correctly, in stages, with specific attention to the cross pattern and the final torque values. Marcus held components and handed fasteners and did not offer suggestions about the sequence, which was its own form of respect. They reinstalled the valve train. They reinstalled the intake manifold, more carefully than the first time, checking the gasket seating at every port. They reinstalled the valve covers. It was noon when they started the engine. Ethan stood at the oil pressure gauge and did not move for 15 minutes. Marcus stood beside him. Normal. 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 The idle settled at 750 revolutions per minute. The temperature climbed to 190 and held. The oil pressure gauge read 62 pounds and did not move. At 14 minutes, Ethan shut the engine off. He let it sit for 5 minutes. He started it again. He watched the gauge. Normal. He ran it for 20 minutes this time. He revved it twice through the RPM range, watching the pressure. The gauge tracked the way it was supposed to track. Higher pressure at higher RPM, settling back to idle pressure as the revs came down. No drop. He shut it off. He and Marcus stood in the quiet of the bay. "Good," Marcus said. It was a small word for what it represented. Ethan nodded. He picked up the notebook and wrote the re-torque reminder. He needed to pull the valve covers one more time after the next heat cycle and re-torque the head bolts to their final spec. Standard practice on any head reinstallation. He wrote it in the notebook and then looked at the remaining timeline. 3 days. He needed to re-torque the heads. He needed to complete the final detailing. The engine bay had been disturbed by the head removal and needed to be cleaned again. He needed to do a second road test to verify the oil pressure under driving conditions. He needed to address the steering heaviness he'd noticed on the first road test, which now that he'd looked at it was a minor toe adjustment at the front wheels, fixable in an hour with the right equipment. And he needed the car to be right. Not close to right. Not as right as possible, given the circumstances. Right. He stood in the bay in the noon light and gave himself exactly 30 seconds to feel the weight of the past 18 hours before he put it down and went back to work. 30 seconds. Then he picked up a rag and started cleaning the engine bay. He almost missed the fuel pressure irregularity. It was on the second road test, the following afternoon, with Derek again in the back seat and Marcus, who had asked, without making a thing of it, in the passenger seat. They were on the same county road, at 60 miles an hour in fourth gear, when Ethan felt something in the throttle response that he categorized immediately as not quite right, but needed a moment to locate precisely. He backed off the throttle and then put it down again, paying attention to the specific moment of re-acceleration. There it was. A small hesitation, such brief, half a second, at the moment of initial throttle application from light cruise. Not the transition into the outer carbs before that, at the very beginning of the throttle movement. "What is it?" Marcus said. He'd felt it too, which told Ethan it was real and not something he was manufacturing from 3 days of hypervigilance. "Accelerator pump response on the center carb," Ethan said. "Maybe fuel pressure. Maybe the pump circuit." He held his speed and put the throttle down smoothly again. Same hesitation, consistent and repeatable, which was at least better than intermittent. "Is it a problem?" Derek asked from the back. "It's not right," Ethan said, which was the answer. He drove back to Sterling. He did not rush. He was past the stage of rushing. In the bay, he pulled the air cleaner from the center carburetor and looked at the accelerator pump circuit. The pump itself, the rubber diaphragm that squirts a stream of fuel into the carburetor bore on initial throttle application to prevent a lean stumble, was new. He'd installed it during the carburetor rebuild. He looked at the pump discharge nozzle. He looked at the check ball that sat below it. He pulled the check ball out and examined it. The check ball was seated slightly off-center. Not dramatically, a fraction of a millimeter, but enough that at light throttle, the ball was not sealing fully before the pump circuit activated, which meant the pump was losing a portion of its discharge back through the unseated check ball before it reached the bore. He reset the check ball. He reinstalled the air cleaner. He started the car. He drove it to the back of the lot and ran it through light throttle applications across the range. The hesitation was gone. He sat in the car in the back lot with the engine idling and the afternoon sun angling through the windshield, and he took a breath. A real one. The kind you take when you've been holding something for a while without noticing. 2 days. He had 2 days and the car was right. Not right in the way that meant he'd stopped worrying. He was going to worry until the morning of day 30, when Calvin stood in front of it and the engine was running and there was nothing more to find. But right in the way that meant he'd done what he could do, and what he'd done was what the car needed. He drove it back to the bay. Marcus was waiting. He'd seen the car go to the back lot and come back, and something in the timeline of it had told him what he needed to know. He looked at Ethan as he came through the bay door. "It's fixed," Ethan said. Marcus nodded once. He was quiet for a moment, standing with his hands in his pockets, and then he said, "You know what you did here." Ethan was setting his keys on the workbench. He looked at Marcus. "I fixed the car," Ethan said. "You fixed the car," Marcus agreed. "And you found 2 problems in the rebuild that would have shown up eventually and caused real damage. Problems that a standard restoration process, a correct and professional one, might not have found." He paused. "That second road test. The fuel hesitation." "The check ball," Ethan said. "I know what it was. I'm saying you felt it." Marcus looked at him. "Not the instruments. You." Ethan didn't know what to say to that. He said, "The instruments confirmed it." "After you already knew," Marcus said. There was a silence between them that was not uncomfortable. Marcus picked up his coffee from the bench and drank it and looked at the car. The orange paint in the afternoon light had the quality it always had at that time of day. Something that went beyond color, something warmer. "Tomorrow," Marcus said. "What do you need?" "Time," Ethan said. "And quiet." "You'll have both," Marcus said. He left. Ethan turned back to the car. 1 day left. He opened the notebook to the last written page and looked at what he'd written there the night before. Not a procedure, not a measurement. A word. He'd written it after Lily had told him to give the car a name that meant it came back, and he'd been thinking about it since. And the word had arrived eventually the way words do when you stop looking for them. He looked at the word for a moment. Then he picked up a rag and started on the final detail of the engine bay, and the car sat in the fading afternoon light of the bay looking exactly like what it was, a thing that had been lost and found its way back. And Ethan worked on in the quiet, which was exactly what he needed. The last day was the quietest one. Ethan arrived at 5:40 in the morning, before the building had any people in it, before the parking lot had any cars in it besides his truck and the overnight security vehicle parked near the main entrance. He let himself into the East Bay with the key Vanessa had given him on day one and stood inside the door for a moment while his eyes adjusted to the dark. He found the light switches and turned on the bay lights one bank at a time, the way he'd done every morning for 30 days. And the Challenger came into view in the center of the space the way it always did. Gradually, in sections, orange paint catching the fluorescent light and giving it back warmer than it arrived. He stood and looked at the car for a full minute without moving. This was something he'd started doing around day 10 without consciously deciding to. Every morning, before the work began, 1 minute of just looking, not assessing, not cataloging what remained, looking at the thing as a whole. It had started as a kind of calibration, a way of keeping the complete object in view rather than getting so far into the components that you lost the sense of what you were building toward. It had become something else over time, something he didn't have a precise word for. He walked to the car and ran his hand along the driver's side door. The paint had the quality it was supposed to have, a depth to it that came from the correct formulation and the application process that Rita's team had used, not a surface impression, but something with dimension. He opened the door and sat in the driver's seat. The interior smelled the way a correctly restored car of this era should smell. Vinyl and metal and a faint trace of the rubber compound in the fresh seals, overlaid with the particular scent of a large displacement engine that had been run recently. Not new, not old, correct. He sat with his hands in his lap and looked at the dash, the gauges. The steering wheel, original, recovered and retreated to correct specification by a specialist in Amarillo. The shifter with its correct black ball and the gear shift pattern embossed in it. The radio with its single knob and its push buttons for the AM band stations that no longer existed. He thought about Calvin at 24 years old, sitting in this seat for the first time after 3 years of weekends in a garage with his father. He thought about what that must have felt like. The accumulation of work arriving finally at the thing the work had been for. The engine starting for the first time and the sound of it filling whatever space they'd been in. He thought about his own father, about Saturday mornings in a garage that smelled like motor oil and coffee and the particular sawdust his father used on spills. About the notebook passed between them in the way that knowledge passes between people who don't have many words for it, but have a great deal of time. He sat in the car for about 10 minutes. Then he got out, closed the door, and went to make coffee in the break room. He had work to do. Not much. The final detail pass on the exterior, the retorque check on the head bolts that he'd been waiting to do after the second heat cycle, a last inspection of every system. By his estimate, it would take until mid-morning, which left the rest of the day before the reveal at 9 o'clock tomorrow. He intended to use the afternoon to do nothing in particular related to the car. He had learned over the years that the final day before a reveal was the most dangerous one for unnecessary intervention. The temptation to keep adjusting, keep finding things, keep working past the point where the work was improving anything. He'd seen other restorers fall into that trap. He'd fallen into it himself once, on a '68 Camaro he'd done in Lubbock, where he'd decided on the final evening to regap the spark plugs and had introduced a misfire he then spent 2 hours chasing before realizing he'd been right the first time. He drank his coffee. He went back to the bay. The retorque took an hour and a half. He pulled both valve covers and went through the head bolt sequence on both banks, driver's side first, then passenger side, with his torque wrench set to the final specification. Most of the bolts were exactly where they should be. One bolt on the passenger side, fourth from the front, had settled fractionally, a normal result of the thermal cycling the engine had been through in the first 30 miles, and took about 15 degrees of additional rotation to reach spec. He noted it in the notebook, not because it was a problem, it wasn't, but because the notebook was a record and a record was a record. He replaced the valve covers. He checked the valve cover gaskets while he had the covers off, which added 20 minutes but confirmed what he expected. The gaskets were seating correctly, no sign of oil seepage at any point along the rails. Then he did the final exterior detail. This was, in the final accounting, the most visible work he would do on the last day, and it was also the work that was most purely about the presentation of what had already been accomplished. Every surface on the exterior got attention. Not aggressive cleaning, not anything that would risk marking the fresh paint, but the careful removal of any fingerprints or smudges that had accumulated during the final assembly stages, the final dressing of the tires and the rubber trim, the polishing of the chrome with the correct product applied with a clean cloth in the correct manner. He did the chrome last: front bumper, rear bumper, window surrounds, door handles, exterior mirrors. Each piece got cleaned and polished and then wiped to remove the polish residue and inspected under a light held at a low angle to catch any remaining marks. Rita Chavez came in while he was doing the driver's door mirror. She stood at the bay entrance with her arms crossed, looking at the car with a proprietary expression that Ethan understood completely. When you've put your work on a surface, that surface becomes personal in a way that goes beyond the professional. "How does the paint look?" she asked. "Like what it's supposed to look like," Ethan said. She came in and walked around the car slowly. She had a light of her own, a slim LED panel that she held at low angles to check for imperfections in the finish, and she used it methodically on each panel. She found 2 very small dust nibs in the paint on the passenger side quarter panel that she would not have found without the light. She stood looking at them for a moment. "I can cut those out," she said. "Are they visible without the light?" Ethan asked. She tried without the light. "No." "Then leave them," he said. Not because he was comfortable with imperfection, but because cutting paint on the final morning before a reveal was another version of the regap the plugs problem. "The paint is right, Rita." She looked at the quarter panel for another moment. "I know," she said. "I know," he said. She put her light away. She walked around the car one more time with her eyes rather than the light and came back to the driver's side. "It looks good, Ethan." "You did the hard part," he said. She shook her head slightly, which was not agreement or disagreement, but something in between. "The paint is what people see," she said. "But the paint is only as good as what's under it." She looked at him. "Whatever you did under here, it holds the paint up." She left. Ethan finished the driver's door mirror. Vanessa found him at 10:30 when the detail work was essentially done and he was doing his final walkthrough, the systematic, nothing left to chance circuit around and through the car that he did at the end of every significant job. She didn't interrupt the walkthrough. She sat on the step stool in the corner and watched him go through it, which took about 40 minutes because he did it without rushing and with the same attention he'd brought to every other part of the process. When he was done, he stood beside the car and looked at it, and then at her. "It's done," he said. She looked at the car for a long moment. "You're certain?" "I'm certain it's right," he said. "I've been certain of that since yesterday afternoon. Today was—" He paused. "Today was making sure I hadn't missed anything while I was busy being certain. And I didn't miss anything." She nodded. She stood from the step stool and walked to the car and looked through the passenger window at the interior. She was quiet for a while. "I owe you an apology," she said. He looked at her. "That first day," she said, "in the meeting. I told you afterward that what changed my mind was the way you presented yourself. That was true. But what I didn't tell you was that I spent the first week of this project waiting for you to fail." She said it evenly, without self-flagellation. "Not wanting you to fail, just expecting it. And every morning when I came in and the work was further along and it was right, I had to revise my expectation." "That's reasonable," Ethan said. "It's not entirely reasonable," she said. "What I was really expecting to fail was the instinct I had when I backed Calvin's decision. I was covering myself. If the project failed, I was going to be able to say I'd had doubts from the start." She paused. "That's not a generous thing to admit." Ethan thought about what to say. He said, "I had doubts too, from the start. I just couldn't afford to show them in that room." She looked at him. "You were scared." "Yes," he said, "but you went in anyway." "I'd looked at the car," he said. "That's what made the difference. Not confidence, just having enough information to justify the risk." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the challenger. "What are you going to do tomorrow, during the reveal?" "Stand back," he said. "It's not mine." The work is yours. The car is his, Ethan said. I'm just the person who listened to it. She looked at him with an expression that was one of the more complex ones he'd seen from her in 30 days, something that was trying to be purely professional and wasn't quite making it. The engineering team is going to be there, she said. Marcus, Derek, the whole department, the investors Calvin is bringing, the board members who were in that first meeting. I know. Some of them laughed, she said. I know that too, he said. Does that... She stopped. Started again. Does it matter to you what they think tomorrow? He thought about it honestly. Some, he said. Not as much as it did on day one. On day one, the thing I was most afraid of was being laughed out of the building. By day 15, the only thing I was afraid of was not getting the car right. He looked at the challenger. The people stop mattering as much as the work. That usually happens when the work gets serious enough. Vanessa was quiet for a while after that. Then she said, I'll see you at 9 tomorrow morning. I'll be here at 6, he said. I know you will, she said. She left. Ethan stood in the bay for a moment and then went to the workbench and closed the notebook and put it in his back pocket, where it always lived, and turned off the bay lights one bank at a time, in reverse order from how he'd turned them on that morning, until the Challenger disappeared into the dark of the empty bay. He drove home. He ate dinner with Lily and Sandra. Lily wanted to know everything about the next day. What time does it start? She asked. 9 in the morning. Are there going to be a lot of people? Some people. Are you nervous? He poured her more milk. A little. She considered this. What are you nervous about? That something will go wrong when I start it, he said, in front of everyone. She thought about this very seriously, which was how she approached most things. But you tested it, she said. You drove it. Yes. And it worked. Yes. So it'll probably work tomorrow too, she said. Probably, he said. She looked at him. Probably isn't the same as definitely. No, he said. It's not. She was quiet for a moment, eating. Then, I think definitely, she said. I think it'll definitely work. He looked at his daughter across the dinner table in the ordinary light of the kitchen, in the ordinary mess of a dinner in progress, and felt something that was too large for the space it was happening in. I think so too, he said. He slept 7 hours, which was the most he'd slept in a single stretch in 3 weeks. He was in the bay at 5:55. He turned the lights on and stood with the car and had his minute of looking and then went to make coffee. He came back. He started the car and let it idle for 20 minutes, watching every gauge on the dash from the driver's seat. Oil pressure at 62, temperature climbing normally, stabilizing at 190, fuel pressure within range, ammeter showing correct charge. He shut it off. He walked the exterior one final time, checking the panel gaps, the chrome, the glass, the tire pressure. He checked the brake fluid level. He checked the coolant overflow. He checked the oil, full, clean, the correct viscosity for this engine in this application. He pulled the car to the center of the bay and positioned it where it would roll out correctly when the time came. People started arriving around 8:15. He could hear them gathering outside the bay without seeing them. Voices through the walls of the building, the sound of cars in the parking lot, the particular acoustic quality of people collecting in an outdoor space. Vanessa had told him she expected 15 or 20 people, the executives and senior staff who'd been in the original meeting, the engineering team, several of Calvin's investors who'd been briefed on the project, Calvin himself, and James. At 8:45, Ethan heard the bay door on the exterior open, the large rolling door that faced the parking lot, and Vanessa stepped inside alone. She looked at the car, at him. She was dressed the way she dressed when something mattered, which she always dressed well, but there was a quality of care in it today that was different from ordinary. "They're ready when you are," she said. "Give me 2 minutes," he said. She nodded. She went back out. He stood beside the car. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out the notebook. He opened it to the last page his father had written on, the one about the 440, the cold weather calibration, the instruction at the bottom, the car knows. Listen to it. He looked at it for a moment, then he looked at the car. "Okay," he said. To the car, or to the memory of his father, or to himself. He couldn't have said precisely, and it didn't matter. "Let's go." He got in. He started the engine. The 440 fired on the first crank. No hesitation, no stumble. The idle settled at 750 revolutions per minute within 8 seconds and stayed there. He sat for a moment with the engine running in the quiet of the bay, and then he put the car in reverse and backed it slowly toward the open door and the morning light. What he saw when he cleared the doorway was more people than Vanessa had described. 30, maybe 35. They were arranged in a loose semicircle in the parking lot in front of the bay door, which had the quality of something that had organized itself rather than being organized. Calvin was near the center of the group with James beside him. Marcus was to the right with his engineering team, Derek, and 2 other engineers Ethan recognized from the original assessment meeting. Several people he didn't know by name, but recognized as executives. Rita from the paint shop, Phil the maintenance tech who'd given him the key to the supply room that night, and Sandra was there. She was standing at the edge of the group with Lily beside her, Lily in the yellow rain jacket despite the clear morning sky. Ethan hadn't known they were coming. He felt the fact of it land in his chest and then deliberately set it aside because he needed to be paying attention to the car. He rolled the Challenger forward into the morning light and stopped it 20 feet in front of the group and put it in neutral and let the engine idle. For a moment, nobody said anything. The morning was clear, and the sun was at the right angle to hit the Hemi-orange paint the way it was designed to be hit. Not washing it out, warming it, making the color do what this particular color was engineered to do, which was to seem like it was generating its own light rather than reflecting light from outside. The chrome caught the sun and threw it in several directions. The car sat in the parking lot with the engine idling at 750 revolutions per minute and looked exactly and completely like what it was. The silence lasted longer than Ethan expected. It was Derek who spoke first, from the engineering side of the group, and what he said was not a professional observation about the quality of the restoration or a technical comment about the paint or the chrome. He said, "Oh, just that. Just the word, in the tone of a person who has been surprised by something." One of the investors said something in a low voice to the man beside him. The man beside him nodded. Marcus Webb was looking at the car with an expression that Ethan had never seen on his face in 30 days and could not have named precisely. Calvin had not moved. He was standing where he'd been when Ethan cleared the door, and he was looking at the car, and he was very still. James put his hand on his father's shoulder. Calvin didn't seem to notice. Ethan got out of the car and stepped to the side. He did not want to be between Calvin and the car. Calvin walked toward it slowly. The kind of slowly that has nothing to do with pace and everything to do with what's happening inside the person walking. He circled the front of the car and came to the driver's side and stood there looking at the length of it. The paint, the chrome, the correct roofline, the glass, the rubber. He reached out and touched the roof with his palm, the same way Lily had touched the hood 3 weeks ago. "I need a minute," he said. He said it to no one in particular or everyone at once. He said it in the voice of a man who is holding something large and has not yet determined whether it will hold. Nobody spoke. The engine idled. Ethan watched him. Calvin stood with his hand on the roof of the car for what might have been a minute and might have been longer. Then he opened the driver's door and sat in the car. He didn't start it. He didn't adjust anything. He just sat in the driver's seat of the car that he had bought at 24 years old and worked on with his father and stored for 30 years because he couldn't stand to sell it and couldn't stand to drive it. And he sat there in the morning sun with the engine idling at 750 revolutions per minute and his hands in his lap. James had come around to stand by the open door. He was looking at his father in the car with an expression that Ethan made a decision not to observe any further because it was not something he had any right to watch. He looked at Sandra and Lily instead. Sandra was watching Calvin in the car with the particular expression of a person who is feeling something by proxy, the transferred emotion of watching someone else experience something significant. Lily was looking at the car with her head slightly tilted, which was how she looked at things she was still deciding about. After a while, Calvin got out of the car. He stood beside it and looked at it from the outside again, the way you look at something when you're confirming that it's real. Then he looked at Ethan. He walked toward him, and Ethan did not move. Calvin stopped about 3 feet away. He was a large man, and he had a quality of contained force that was not intimidating exactly, but was present. I don't know how to, he started, stopped. There's no. He shook his head, which was not frustration, but the opposite of it, the specific movement of a man who has arrived at the edge of language and found that language stops there. You don't have to, Ethan said. Calvin looked at him. My father would have wanted to meet you, he said. Ethan did not have an immediate response to that. He received it and nodded. Tell me what it cost you, Calvin said. Not the money, the other cost. It was 30 days, Ethan said. I've had worse. That's not an answer, Calvin said. Ethan thought about the nights, about the oil pressure crisis at 2 a.m, about the casting fragment and Marcus crouching in an expensive shirt to help him pull the head, about the fuel hesitation and the check ball, and the 30 seconds he gave himself in the back parking lot before putting the work away and going back in, about Lily in the yellow jacket touching the hood. It cost me some sleep, he said, and some worry, and a partial thumbnail. He looked at his left hand where the nail was still growing back. That's what it cost. Calvin looked at him for another moment. What do you want? Calvin said. Not what Vanessa is going to offer you. What do you personally want from this? Ethan thought about it. I want people to know it was possible, he said. That's mostly what I wanted from the start. I wanted to prove that the assessment was wrong. He paused. Not to be right. To show that the thing everyone decided was over wasn't over. Why did that matter to you? The question was more direct than Ethan was prepared for. He held it for a moment. Because things get written off too fast, he said. Machines, jobs, people. He stopped. My father was told he was done at 45, that his skill set was obsolete, that the work he did wasn't needed anymore. He wasn't done. He had 20 more years of work in him, and he spent them doing smaller and smaller jobs because nobody was willing to look past the verdict. He looked at the car. I have a thing about verdicts handed down too fast. Calvin was quiet for a long time. So do I, he said finally. He put his hand out. Ethan shook it. The engineers came to look at the car. This was not an organized event. It happened the way things happen when people who are curious about something find themselves near it. They gathered around it in ones and twos and threes, opening the hood, crouching to look at the undercarriage, opening doors, looking at the interior. They spoke among themselves in the technical shorthand of people who work with machines and are confronted with work that is genuinely correct. Marcus stood at the front of the car with the hood open for a while. When Ethan came to stand beside him, neither of them said anything for a moment. The head reseat is invisible, Marcus said finally. Gerald's machining and Rita's touch-up work on the valve covers, Ethan said. You can't tell it was touched. That's the point. Marcus was quiet. He reached in and touched the intake manifold. A learned habit, the touch before you talk instinct. The casting fragment, he said, found it on the second road test. I know, I was there. He looked at the engine. It could have failed in 6 months, could have failed in 6 years, could have run another 50,000 miles. I didn't want to find out which, Ethan said. Marcus nodded. He'd have made the same call. He looked at Ethan. I've been in this field for 22 years, he said. I don't think I've ever watched someone work the way you work. You work the same way, Ethan said. You just do it with different tools. Marcus shook his head slightly. Not entirely. There's something in your process, He stopped. The tactile assessment, the way you hear things. I had it once. I let it go. He looked at the engine again. I don't know if you get it back. You helped me pull that head, Ethan said. I know. Your hands remembered the sequence, Ethan said. You didn't look at me once for guidance on the removal procedure. Marcus was quiet. Something moved in his expression that was worth watching, but that Ethan did not make a spectacle of watching. I noticed that too, Marcus said. Derek had been nearby enough to hear some of this and had the good sense to be looking at the exhaust manifolds rather than at them. Ethan caught the slight angle of Derek's attention and said nothing about it. 2 of the other engineers, the ones who had been in the original assessment meeting, who had looked at the photographs of the burned car and arrived at the same conclusions as Marcus, came to where Ethan and Marcus were standing. The first one, a woman named Petra, who ran the structural team, said, "The frame assessment we did on day 1. "Yes," Ethan said. "You were right about the driver's side forward rails," she said. "I've looked at Marcus's follow-up measurements. The core integrity was better than we reported." "The visual deformation was significant," Ethan said. "Your assessment wasn't unreasonable." "It was incomplete," she said. She said it without drama, just as a fact. "We didn't have the information you had." "You didn't have the time I had," Ethan said. "I spent 6 hours with that car before the meeting. You had 2. "We could have taken more time," the second engineer said. His name was Rob, and he'd written the drivetrain section of the original report. "We had a deadline for the insurance documentation. We let the deadline drive the depth." This was as honest an admission as Ethan had heard from anyone in 30 days, and he respected it fully. "It's a reasonable way to work under normal circumstances," he said. "But not for this one," Petra said. "Not for this one," he agreed. They stood around the engine bay together for a while, 4 people who had been on opposite sides of an argument that had since resolved itself into something more useful than opposition. Lily appeared beside him at some point mid-morning while he was standing near the rear of the car, watching people interact with it and staying out of the way. She arrived the way she always arrived, slightly sideways, as if she hadn't entirely decided to be there yet. She looked at the car for a moment. "It's better in the sun," she said. "Most things are," he said. "Did you give it a name?" He looked at her. He'd been waiting for this question. "I was thinking about what you said," he told her. "About a name that means it came back." "Did you think of one?" "I wrote one down," he said, "in the notebook." She looked at him with the full attention expression. "What is it?" He reached into his back pocket and pulled out the notebook and opened it to the page. He held it so she could see the word he'd written there the night after the second road test, in the quiet of the bay with the car sitting in the fading light. She read it. She thought about it. "Phoenix," she said. "It's a bird from a story," he said. "It burns up and comes back." She looked at the car, at the orange paint in the morning sun. "It's orange," she said, as if this confirmed something she'd already decided. "It is," he said. "That's a good name," she said. She put her hand in his, which she did without ceremony when she felt like it, and which never stopped surprising him in the way it had the first time she'd done it, years ago, when she was small enough that her whole hand fit in his palm. They stood there watching people look at the car. Sandra came to stand on his other side. She didn't say anything. The 3 of them stood there in the morning sun with the orange car in front of them and the sound of the crowd and the occasional note of the engine when someone started it and let it idle for a moment before shutting it down again. At some point, Calvin's son James came to stand near them. Not intrusively. He came to look at the car the way everyone else was looking at the car and happened to end up in the same area. He looked at Lily. "Is that your dad?" he asked. Lily looked at Ethan. "Yes," she said. James looked at the car. "He did good work," James said. "I know," Lily said. "He always does." James was quiet for a moment. He was watching his father, who had come back to stand beside the car and had his hand on the roof again, the same gesture. Calvin kept returning to that gesture, the palm flat on the metal, as if checking that it was still there. "Your father and his father," James said. Not quite to Lily, not quite to Ethan, more to the air between them. "They built something together." "Yes," Ethan said. "My father and his father built this car," James said, "and then it was gone. And then—" He stopped. He looked at Ethan. "You gave him something back." Ethan didn't have a response that fit the weight of what James was saying. He said, "The car did most of it." James looked at him with the same quality of assessment his father had, something sharp and direct behind whatever expression lived on the surface. "No," James said. "It didn't." He moved away through the crowd. Ethan watched him go back to his father, watched them stand together beside the car in the morning sun, watched Calvin say something to his son, and his son nod. Vanessa found him just before noon. The crowd had thinned by then. People had moved back inside for the working day. or left for wherever they were going, or were still standing around the car in smaller groups. The initial shock of the reveal had given way to the quieter, more sustained quality of people who were still processing what they'd seen. She pulled him aside to the edge of the parking lot near the building, where they could talk without being in the middle of anything. "I need to tell you some things," she said. He waited. "Calvin is staying," she said. "He called me this morning before the reveal. He's moving a significant portion of his classic vehicle portfolio to Sterling, not just for restoration work, but for ongoing management." She paused. "He said the reason was that he'd seen what this shop is capable of when it works the way it's supposed to work." "That's good for the company," Ethan said. "It is." She looked at him. "It's also good for something I've been thinking about for the past 2 weeks." She was choosing her words with care, which he'd noticed she did when the stakes of the conversation were higher than normal. "We have the infrastructure here for a dedicated classic restoration division, separate from the performance engineering work, a team whose function is exactly what you've been doing in that bay for 30 days. He understood where this was going. He looked at her without saying anything. "I want you to run it," she said, "not as a mechanic reporting up to engineering, as a director with full technical authority over the restoration process. You build the team, you set the standards, you run the jobs." He was quiet for a moment. "I don't have the credentials for that title," he said. "Not as a refusal, as information." "I know that," she said. "I don't care about the credentials. I've watched you work for 30 days. I know what you can do." She paused. "The title is about authority. It's about making sure that when you walk into a room and say something is possible, people listen." He thought about the conference room on day 1, the laughter, the particular quality of that sound. "They'll resent it," he said. "Some of them." "Some," she said. "Fewer than you think. Marcus won't. Derek won't." She looked at him. "Petra came to me this morning and said," and I'm quoting her, "that she'd like to work alongside you on the structural assessments going forward. That's not resentment." He was quiet for a longer moment. "What would the team look like?" he asked. "That's your call," she said. "Within budget, which I'll outline. But the composition of the team, who you want, what the workflow is, how the jobs are assessed and prioritized, that's yours." He looked at the car. At the Challenger sitting in the diminishing crowd of the morning, its orange paint doing what it did in the afternoon light. "I want to think about it," he said. "Take the time you need," she said. "I'm not going anywhere, and neither is the opportunity." He nodded. She turned to go, then stopped. "One more thing," she said. "Okay." "Calvin called me separately this morning, before the reveal." She paused. "He's established a fund, an educational fund, in Lily's name. It's separate from any compensation we're discussing. It has nothing to do with your employment here. He wanted me to tell you because he didn't want to tell you himself and have you feel like you couldn't say no." Ethan went very still. "He said to tell you it's for her future," Vanessa said. "He said to tell you it's not a payment. It's just, he wanted to do something." She looked at him. "He said you'd understand what he meant." Ethan understood exactly what Calvin meant. He understood it in the way you understand things that arrive from a direction you weren't watching. He nodded. He couldn't say anything immediately, which Vanessa recognized and did not try to fill. "Take the afternoon," she said. "You've been in this bay for 30 days. Go be somewhere else for a few hours." "I still need to close out the bay," he said. "The tools, the documentation." "Tomorrow," she said. He looked at the bay. At the empty space where the Challenger had lived for a month, the floor marked by the car's weight and the work that had been done on and around it. "Tomorrow," he said. He went to find Lily. She was with Sandra near the back of the parking lot, at the point where the lot met a strip of grass that ran along the property line. Lily had found something in the grass, a caterpillar by the look of her posture, and was crouched over it with the full focus she brought to small creatures. He stood behind her for a moment. "Bug," he said. She looked up. "There's a caterpillar," she said. "It's really slow." "They are," he said. "You want to go get lunch? Wherever you want." She stood up and thought about this with her characteristic thoroughness. "The place with the onion rings." "That place it is," he said. She took his hand. They walked toward Sandra and the car, and Ethan did not look back at the bay or the building or the orange car that was still visible at the far end of the lot, catching the sun. He'd been looking at it for 30 days. He could look somewhere else for an afternoon. He took 3 days before he gave Vanessa his answer. Not because he was uncertain. He'd known the answer before she finished asking the question. In the parking lot, with the crowd still thinning behind them and the orange car sitting in the sun. He knew it the way he knew most things that mattered, not from thinking about it, but from recognizing something that had already been decided somewhere beneath the level of thought. He took 3 days because he'd learned, mostly from watching other people make fast decisions and live with the consequences, that the feeling of certainty was not the same thing as certainty, and that 3 days cost nothing while a wrong decision cost considerably more. He spent those 3 days closing out the East Bay. This was its own kind of work, not the dramatic work of the restoration, but the necessary, unglamorous work of returning a space to order. He cataloged the remaining parts, organized them for storage, logged them in the project file. He cleaned the tools and returned them to the supply room with the forms filled out correctly. He mopped the floor, which had accumulated 30 days of oil and solvent and general shop debris, and when the floor was clean, the bay looked different than it had, larger, plainer, without the orange car in the center of it giving the space a reason for being. He stood in the empty bay on the second afternoon and felt the absence of the car as a physical thing. This was something that happened after significant restoration jobs. The project took up so much space in your thinking and your daily life that when it was finished, the space it had occupied didn't immediately fill with anything else. It just was empty, and the emptiness was its own kind of information. He thought about what Vanessa was offering. He thought about what it would mean to build a team, to set standards, to walk into a room and have the authority to say what was right, and have people take the measure of that statement without first measuring him against his credentials and his title and his position on the org chart. He thought about the meetings he would have to run, and the decisions he would have to defend, and the administrative load that came with any position above the shop floor, which he had no experience with and no particular appetite for. He also thought about the cars, about what it would mean to do this work, the right work, the careful work, the work that treated each object as worthy of the full attention you could give it, at a scale that one man working alone in a borrowed bay could never reach, about what it would mean to pass that approach to other people, to find the ones who had the instinct and give them the space to develop it. He thought about his father, about the verdict handed down at 45 that had sent him to smaller and smaller jobs, not because his ability had diminished, but because the institutional machinery that decides what expertise is worth had moved on without him, about what his father might have become with a different set of circumstances, about the notebook that lived in Ethan's back pocket. The record of everything his father had known continued now in Ethan's own cramped handwriting, still accumulating. On the third morning, he went to Vanessa's office and told her yes. She didn't make a production of it. She said good, and asked him to be ready to meet with her and the HR director the following week to work out the specifics, and then asked him if he had any immediate questions. He had a few. They talked for 20 minutes, then he went back to work. The first person he told was Marcus. Not because he was required to, the announcement would be made officially through the normal channels, but because Marcus had earned it. The 30 days had produced something between them that didn't have an easy name. Not friendship exactly, not mentorship in either direction, but a mutual recognition that had taken some time and some adversity to arrive at, and that both of them understood was real. He found Marcus in the engineering department's main workspace, at a standing desk with a set of chassis specifications on his screen. "I took the job," Ethan said. Marcus looked at him. "The director position." "Yes." Marcus was quiet for a moment. He saved whatever he was working on and turned to face Ethan fully, which was its own kind of statement. "Good," Marcus said. He said it the way he said things he meant without embellishment. "I'm going to need help," Ethan said. "On the structural assessment side, building a protocol that bridges tactile evaluation and instrumental measurement." "I told you I wanted to document your method," Marcus said. "And I'm telling you, I want your input on how to make it systematic," Ethan said. "What you know about structural engineering and what I know about hands-on assessment, there's something in the combination that neither of us has alone." Marcus looked at him for a moment. You're going to make me get back on the shop floor. Sometimes, Ethan said. If you're willing. Marcus picked up his coffee. He looked at it rather than at Ethan, which was how he looked at things when he was actually thinking rather than performing the act of thinking. Yes, he said. I'm willing. Ethan nodded. He turned to go. Ethan, Marcus said. He stopped. The question you answered in that conference room on day one, Marcus said, about whether you were certain or just hoping. He paused. I've been thinking about that answer for a month. Both. You said both. Yes. That's honest in a way most people aren't, Marcus said. In a room full of people where certainty is currency, you said both. That took something. It took knowing that I'd looked at the car and they hadn't, Ethan said. The looking gave me enough to stand on. Marcus nodded. The looking, he said. That's what we stopped doing. He turned back to his screen. Ethan left. 8. Derek was easier and harder at the same time. Easier because Derek was 26 and had not yet accumulated the layers of professional scar tissue that make honesty complicated. Harder because Derek was 26, and the thing Ethan needed to say to him required a particular kind of directness that could land wrong if the relationship between them hadn't been built on something solid enough to hold it. He found Derek in the break room on a Thursday afternoon, eating lunch alone with a technical journal open on the table that he wasn't actually reading. Ethan sat across from him. I'm building a team for the restoration division, Ethan said. I want you on it. Derek looked up. His expression went through several things quickly. As an engineer. As whatever you are, Ethan said. Your degree is useful. Your instincts are better than your degree. I want both. Derek set down his fork. I've only been here 18 months. I know. There are senior engineers who have more experience and fewer instincts, Ethan said. Or the other way around. I'm not building a seniority ladder. I'm building a team that can do this specific kind of work correctly. He looked at Derek. You came to the Bay every afternoon for 3 weeks and never once picked up a tool without being asked. You watched, and you asked questions, and you listened to the answers. That's rarer than you think. Derek was quiet. He looked at the journal he wasn't reading, and then at Ethan. The sound when the outer carbs open, Derek said. Yes. I've been thinking about that since the road test, he said. About what you said. That it's not in any manual. About all the things that aren't in any manual that determine whether something is right or wrong. That's the work, Ethan said. Finding those things. Learning to hear them. I don't know if I can hear them yet, Derek said. I know you can't, Ethan said. That's why you'd be joining the team, not running it. Derek almost smiled. It was the honest, slightly uncomfortable smile of someone who has been told something true that they needed to hear. Okay, Derek said. Yes. Ethan stood. Finish your lunch, he said. We start the intake assessment on the next project next Monday. What's the next project? A 1969 Mustang Fastback, Ethan said. Barn find, 23 years in storage. The owner thinks it's restorable. We're going to find out. Derek looked at the journal. He closed it and pushed it aside. Monday, he said. Calvin came to see him one more time before the formal announcement. It was a Saturday. The building was quiet, skeleton crew only, and Ethan was in the new space that Vanessa had designated for the Classic Restoration Division, which was currently an empty room adjacent to the East Bay that smelled like paint, an industrial cleaner, and potential. He was measuring the floor space and making notes about how to configure the work bays. Calvin arrived without announcement, which was a pattern Ethan had come to expect from him. He stood at the door of the empty room and looked at the space and then at Ethan. Starting fresh, Calvin said. More or less, Ethan said. He wrote a measurement down. Calvin came in. He looked at the walls, the floor, the overhead lighting that was adequate but not ideal and would need to be supplemented. He was doing what he'd been doing every time Ethan saw him, assessing, in the way that people who have built things assess spaces. James and I had dinner last week, Calvin said. Ethan looked at him. First dinner in about 4 years, Calvin said. Just the two of us. He looked at the floor. The car came up. He'd been thinking about it, about what it meant that I'd kept it without telling him it existed. What did you tell him? Ethan asked. The truth, Calvin said. that it was the last thing I had that my father touched, that I couldn't share it because sharing it would have made it real, and if it was real, it could be lost. He paused. He asked me why I didn't feel that way about the things between us. The years of distance. A pause. I didn't have a good answer. Ethan said nothing. This was not his territory. He said, James said that the car was worth saving because someone decided to look at it instead of away from it. Calvin looked at Ethan. He said the same was probably true of most things worth saving. Ethan held that for a moment. Your son is smarter than he lets on, Ethan said. Calvin almost laughed. He gets it from his mother, he said. Not from me. They stood in the empty room together for a moment. In the Saturday quiet of the building, two men who had arrived at an understanding that hadn't required all the words you might have expected. The fun for Lily, Ethan said. He'd been waiting for the right moment to address it directly. I want you to know that I... Don't, Calvin said. Not rudely, firmly. It's already done. It doesn't require anything from you. If you thank me, I'll feel like a transaction happened, and I don't want that. Ethan looked at him. Just take care of her, Calvin said. That's all. That's all I was ever going to do anyway, Ethan said. Calvin nodded. He looked around the empty room one more time. What are you going to do with this space? Ethan held up his notebook. I've got some ideas. Calvin looked at the notebook. The battered, taped, 15-year-old thing that had been in the same back pocket through 30 of the most demanding days of Ethan's professional life. That notebook, Calvin said. Someday, when it's full, don't throw it away. I won't, Ethan said. My father had a book like that, Calvin said. Spiral-bound red cover, full of engine notes and phone numbers and God knows what else. I threw it away 6 months after he died. He was quiet. I still think about that. Ethan reached back and touched the notebook in his pocket, the familiar weight of it. I'll keep it, he said. Calvin left. Ethan stood in the empty room for a while after he was gone, not measuring anything, just standing in the space that was about to become something. But the announcement went out on a Wednesday. An internal memo, then a company-wide meeting, then a press release for the trade publications that covered the performance and restoration industry. Sterling Performance Group's new Classic Restoration Division, under the technical direction of Ethan Brooks. The memo was professional and dry, and contained exactly the information it needed to contain. What the memo didn't contain was the part that Ethan kept returning to in the days that followed, in the moments between the meetings and the planning sessions, and the logistics of building something from the ground up. He thought about what it meant that a burned car in a warehouse had changed the direction of his life. Not in the dramatic way of transformation narratives, not the lightning bolt, not the single defining moment of revelation. In the slower, more ordinary way that most actual change happens. One problem at a time, one night at a time, one small correction at a time until the sum of all the corrections became something different from what had existed before. He thought about verdicts, about how quickly and casually they get issued. The burned car was a total loss. The 45-year-old mechanic is obsolete. The man who fixed things for a living and never got the title to prove it was a man whose expertise existed but whose authority to exercise it did not. He thought about all the things that got written off, not because they were actually finished, but because the people assessing them had run out of time or patience or belief and had moved on, and the thing itself had no voice to object. He was not a man given to large philosophical statements. He did not think of himself as someone who had anything to say about the world in the abstract, but he had spent 30 days with a car that everyone agreed was dead, and the car had disagreed, and the disagreement had turned out to be correct. That fact sat in him in a permanent way. Not as a lesson he could deliver in a sentence, but as something he'd absorbed through his hands and his back and his insufficient sleep, and that would inform how he moved through whatever came next. Some things are not over when they look over. Some things only need someone willing to look past the verdict. That was not everything he knew. Some things were genuinely finished. Some assessments were right. The skill, the real skill, the thing that couldn't be taught in a classroom or confirmed by a certificate, was knowing the difference. Not from theory, but from contact. From the willingness to put your hands on the thing and feel it for yourself rather than taking the report at face value. His father had tried to teach him that, in the cramped handwriting of a composition notebook passed between them in a garage that smelled like motor oil and coffee. Ethan had tried to live it, imperfectly, through his 20s and into his 30s. He was still trying. He expected he would be trying for the rest of his life, which was not a discouraging thought, but an honest one. On the Friday after the announcement, Petra came to his new office, a converted storage room that he was still in the process of making functional, with a file under her arm and an expression that was professional and slightly nervous, which he found humanizing. "The Mustang intake assessment," she said. "I'd like to be part of it." "I know," he said. "I was going to ask you." She set the file on his desk, which was still technically a folding table, and looked around the room. "This space needs work," she said. "Everything worth doing needs work," he said. She looked at him with the expression of someone who is determining whether a thing was said as a platitude or as an actual statement. She seemed to arrive at actual statement. "Monday?" she said. "Monday," he said. She left. He opened the file. The preliminary photographs of the Mustang were on top, a pale yellow fastback pulled from a barn in East Texas, dusty and mouse-nested and surface-rusted and sitting on flat tires with a cracked windshield. 23 years of inattention visible in every photograph. He looked at it the way he'd looked at the Challenger on that first morning in the damaged bay. He was looking for what it still was, not for what it had become. He picked up his notebook and opened it to a fresh page. He thought about what Lily had said about the caterpillar in the parking lot grass. "It's really slow." He thought about what she'd said about the car. "It looks like it wants to go somewhere." He thought about the way she'd looked at the photograph in the file the previous Sunday when he'd brought some work home. She'd looked at the dusty yellow Mustang for a long time before saying with complete seriousness, "That one's sad. You should fix it." He wrote the date at the top of the page. He wrote the car's particulars, year, model, current condition as visible in the photographs. He wrote, "First impression, more there than the photographs suggest. Assess in person before conclusions." He looked at that last line. Then he closed the notebook and put it in his back pocket where it belonged, and he went back to measuring the room. There was a team to build, and a car to look at and work to be done. And the work was not going to do itself, and that had always been fine with him. That had always been exactly fine. Outside in the main yard, the afternoon light was doing what afternoon light does in October in North Texas. Going gold and long-angled, the kind of light that makes ordinary things look like they mean something. Somewhere on the other side of the building, in a climate-controlled space that Calvin had arranged and paid for, the orange Challenger sat in the quiet. Not running, not being looked at, just existing in the way that objects exist when the work on them is truly finished, complete in itself, needing nothing more from anyone. Ethan didn't need to see it to know it was there. He picked up his measuring tape and got back to work.